Chapter 551. The End of an Age. Snow blanketed the gardens of Tyrol in silence, muting even the distant howls of wolves along the forest edge. A frost had settled upon the old stones of the estate, creeping across windows, wrapping marble statues in a glistening sheen of stillness. But the cold inside was heavier still. Bruno stood at the far end of the drawing room, his back to the fire. Its warmth did not reach him. Not tonight. It had been less than a fortnight since he had left the Tsar's winter palace with news of the man's terminal condition. He had made no theatrical farewells, no overt displays of finality. And yet his words the previous night still echoed like church bells in Bruno's mind. When your father follows, I shall tell him of the man you became. It should have been comforting. It felt like a gravestone. Heidi entered quietly, her boots brushing snow from the hem of her fur-lined gown. She said nothing at first, simply setting down a tray of tea beside the armchair that Bruno hadn't sat in since yesterday. Her eyes drifted to him, studied his stiff posture, his unreadable gaze toward the hearth. It's not your fault, she said gently, as if the silence had accused him. Bruno exhaled through his nose. I know that. A lie, or at least a half-truth. He always knew that the great men who guided his youth would one day be gone. But he did not expect that the time for them to fall would come so soon, so close together, as if history itself were making room for a new epoch. And he did not expect to feel so alone while witnessing it. It's not their passing that bothers me. In my past life, I had looked up to these men, idolized them. The last kings and knights of a bygone generation. A better generation. A pause. A sigh. When I came into this life with my memories of the old one somehow still intact, I forged ties to the men I respected most, but I never gave myself a chance to live in the moment. I always viewed them from the perspective of the old world, figures on a page, not friends to be made. And now that I finally understand this, the opportunity is gone. Heidi moved beside him and rested her head against his arm. Even with knowledge of the future and the world that was, you're still a man, love. You're not a god. You're prone to mistakes. And it is okay to lament what could have been. We all have such thoughts. Bruno chuckled, hollow. And yet, I alone must grieve with 2 lifetimes of regret. Silence persisted. Heidi did not know how to heal such a wound. She could only sit there and hug the man, as her warmth and presence would have to be enough. But history did not wait for morning. Elsewhere, it plodded in silence. Across the Atlantic, in a country blinded by prosperity and pride, President Hoover sipped bourbon and stared at the letter from his Secretary of the Treasury. It was filled with bland praise and empty figures, all singing the tune of recovery. But Hoover knew better. America had not recovered. It had been rescued. Shares once worthless had been bought en masse. Defunct rail lines, collapsed shipping companies, entire banks quietly salvaged from the wreckage. And yet no single entity could be blamed. The trail was too clean, too well paved. Layers upon layers of paper corporations, shell firms, offshore entities. All legal, all clever, and all pointing to a ghost. Hoover closed the file and muttered to himself, Damn you, Bruno. He had searched tirelessly for the slightest trace of evidence. Yet nothing was conclusive. Fragments here, or they're dating back decades. If one were to gaze upon the web he had spun in search of the truth, they might think he had gone insane. But it was becoming increasingly clear to him that Bruno had been buying up land, resources, companies, and industries across the United States. The web Bruno had cast was wide, wider than he had ever thought it was when he was first alerted to the German influence over the American media. And the worst part was that he could not prove it. His evidence was inconclusive. At best it was conspiratorial. At worst it was little more than the ramblings of a madman. No one would believe him, not when jobs were returning, breadlines shortening, and spirits cautiously rising. He was a prisoner of his own success. He could only sigh and accept it. Whatever happened as a result of this, he could not control nor prevent. It was a problem for another president to deal with, another generation to endure. Back in Tyrol, Bruno finally accepted the tea. It was lukewarm, slightly bitter, just as he preferred. Heidi smiled faintly and returned to her embroidery, leaving him to his thoughts. The fire cracked. The wind howled. And Bruno thought of his father. Aside from the yearly family reunions, this was the first time Bruno had actually seen his father in years. Decades even. Since he first left the home, He had little contact without his family outside organized gatherings of the house once or twice a year. Letters had come, as they always did, stiff and formal, laced with concern but never emotion. The last spoke of aching bones, long nights, and memories of the old wars. He could picture him now, sitting on the sofa of the old family estate in Prussia, a glass of the finest spirits in hand, cane resting by the door, watching the snow fall out the window next to the warmth of the fireplace in the same silence Bruno now kept. Perhaps it was time. He stood. Heidi looked up, surprised. Going somewhere. I think I need to see him. She smiled, understanding. Then take Erwin with you. Your father should meet your son properly, not as the boy he was, but the man he has become. Bruno nodded. That alone made the journey worthwhile. The next morning, the train departed east. Bruno sat beside Erwin, who had inherited his mother's grace and his father's eyes. He stared at the frost outside, nose nearly pressed to the glass. It's funny, you and mother rarely speak of your childhood together. But from what I gather, you were betrothed at a young age. Did you see each other frequently? Once or twice a month. I spent most of my free time in the family library memorizing every dusty old tome gathered since its founding. She accompanied me when she came over. More a nuisance than anything in those days. Hard to believe I fell in love with the brat. Bruno chuckled when he said this, his tone gentle, his eyes filled with nostalgia. Erwin stared at his father in disbelief for a second, trying to make sure he had heard correctly. You memorized the entire family library? Bruno nodded his head with indifference. By the age of 7, not word for word, mind you. Nobody's that capable, but the essence of every sentence written and the information contained in it, yes. After that, I spent my days training in more noble pursuits like chess, horseback riding, swordplay, and marksmanship. I even took my hand at ballroom dancing for a bit. Never much cared for it, though. Erwin was stunned by his father's words once more as he sat there in silence. He had known his father was gifted beyond any other man or woman he had ever met. But was this not a bit too monstrous of a revelation? In fields of Prussia, the air was sharper, the trees taller, and the silence even deeper. The old family estate had not changed. It never would. Bruno's father was sitting on the sofa, just as imagined. Thinner, paler, but still with eyes like polished iron. He rose when they approached. So the heir apparent returns, he said with a voice like gravel. Bruno said nothing. Instead, he motioned to Erwin, who bowed politely. The old man took her hand gently. You have your grandfather's shoulders. You should have been a soldier. Neither Erwin nor Bruno smiled. Erwin was the first in the family's history not to continue the family tradition of military service. And while Bruno's father had named him heir for political reasons, he had never approved of the man breaking this tradition. Even so, they spoke into the night. Of wars. Of regrets. Of the changing world. When the fire had dimmed, Bruno's father spoke softly. You have 8 brothers, all of which still live. All of which have children of their own. And yet I did what I should have never been allowed to do. I personally named you my sole heir, violating centuries of aristocratic tradition in the process. Bruno stiffened, but he did not stir. Are you expressing regret for this decision? I never asked this of you. His father nodded. No, but it was necessary nonetheless. My youngest son becoming a grand prince, and the rest of the family, decades of service still junkers, raised to the position of count solely because of your accomplishments. There was dreadful pause between the two as the words settled. If you were not named my heir, do you have any idea the damage this could cause in the future? It was necessary, because you shine too bright, just like your mother always said you would. From the moment you were born, she said you were different. Silence passed between them, heavier than the years. Finally, Bruno asked, What are you asking me? The old man smiled without joy. Before I enter the grave, can't you satisfy my curiosity? As great as our bloodline has been, you should not have been born of my line. Perhaps Alexander's, but not my own. Who are you? What are you really? Bruno could only smirk as he shook his head, laughing at the whole ordeal. Of course there would have been others to figure it out. However, his words were twisted with prose, more than honesty. I am the scourge of God. If the world had not committed such great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you all. He was paraphrasing Genghis Khan with this statement, and his father knew it, causing his lips to curl into a smirk as he sipped from his drink. his statement surprising even Bruno when he said them. I knew it. When they returned to Tyrol, a letter awaited. From St. Petersburg. Wax seal intact. It read simply, "The time has come. I go to God now. May our children never forget that we once dared to shape the world." Signed, Nicholas II, Emperor of all the Russians. Bruno folded the letter with trembling hands and poured himself a drink. He stared into the glass and saw the end of an age. Chapter 552, Smoke over Seoul. Smoke rose from Seoul as sirens blared across the distance. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Corps had been mustered and was in the sky. Its planes spiraled toward the earth below at terminal velocity. And those were the ones not disintegrated before their smoldering wreckages crashed into the city streets. Artillery rocked the world and those who lived within it. Gunfire raged, fiercer and fierce, and then softer, until, finally, only a few crackles here and there could be heard, like the pitter-patter of a storm in its final moments. Then finally silence. The spring of 1932 brought with it a fierce offensive by the Russians in the north, who had spent the last year mobilizing 250,000 additional men to support what remained of the initial 100,000 who crossed into the Korean peninsula in the fall of 1929. Time and again the Japanese refused to surrender, fighting until the last man, the last bullet fired, and the last blade in hand. It caused significant enough casualties and an expense of resources so monumental that Russia was forced to halt its advance and wait for resupply time and again. Despite their advanced technology and massive industrial output, transporting logistics across the entire Asian continent took time. Because of this, the Imperial Russian Army had simply not fell upon the Japanese like a fierce tidal wave of steel and lead. Instead, minimizing casualties through advanced tactics learned from the Germans and the advisors sent to ensure that the Russians had properly integrated with Bruno's doctrine. Major General Georgy Zhukov had been given the task of taking Seoul, and he now walked in its streets. The Imperial Japanese Army which defended the occupied city lay dead in the streets, not a single one willing to surrender. To do so would be to dishonor their fallen emperor. By his side was a German face of a lower rank. A German colonel. He wore his winter coat, as the snow had yet to entirely clear in the region, gazing upon the destruction and death with a pitiful gaze. They really do not give up, do they? A pity. No matter how valiant and courageous they meet their end, they will inevitably be overwhelmed. We have superior weapons, superior tactics, and superior logistics. But most importantly, we have complete and total command of the air. Zhukov turned to the man, who was 5 years his senior, and yet a lower rank in his own nation's armed forces. He was quick to look him up and down, noticing the many medals that had been won during the man's service during the Great War. And tell me, Colonel Rommel, if you understand the situation so well, why are you not yet a general? Here you are serving as an attaché to my army, instead of commanding your own forces in the South Pacific. Rommel sighed as he warmed his gloved hands by rubbing them together and breathing on them. With no disrespect, the situation in the German army is quite different from your own. We have generations of talent vying for positions in the general staff. I am but one of many who could qualify. You are one of few Russia has to offer who is remotely comparable to our average colonel. Zhukov narrowed his gaze at Rommel's words. The arrogance of the Germans never ceased to astound him, and Rommel could tell the man was not happy, quickly pointing to a destroyed E-25 tank that had suffered a direct hit from a Japanese tank mine while crossing through an entrenched position. Case in point, in this battle alone you lost 39 armored vehicles, half of them immobilized by mines you failed to detect, the rest due to poor tactical spacing. You called it a necessary loss. In Germany, that would be called mid-sized incompetence. Zhukov's jaw stiffened. The Japanese are fanatics. They've booby-trapped entire neighborhoods, buried mines beneath children's toys. You'd have done no better. Rommel tilted his head, amused. You think so? I would have pulled back the moment my scouts reported urban saturation. Let the city starve. Bomb the water mains. Wait for the rats to turn on the living. But you Russians? You always insist on taking the hard way, like you're afraid to win unless it costs you blood. Zhukov stepped closer. We took the city, didn't we? Yes, Rommel said simply, his hands still warming in his coat. And at the rate you're burning through material, you'll take another 6 months to push past Taejon. Maybe longer. Your emperor will be pleased, until he sees the ledger. Silence. Snow drifted down, beginning to layer itself over the blackened corpses in the rubble. Rommel turned and began walking down the broken boulevard, his boots crunching glass and ash. Zhukov followed a moment later, slower, his voice cold. You may look down on my army, Rommel, but we are learning. We've adapted more in 5 years than your generals thought possible. And with each new campaign, we'll match you. Rommel didn't turn around. You're imitating, he said. And imitation always lags behind the original. At that, Zhukov laughed bitterly. Is that why you're here? To supervise the copycat? Rommel stopped. Then, calmly, without venom, I'm here to make sure you don't embarrass us. Zhukov blinked. Us? You think the West believes Russia could have taken Korea alone? The rifles you use, the planes you fly, the tanks you march so carelessly into landmines and entrenched anti-tank guns. It was all licensed from us. Rommel began to pace about the snow, looking at the corpses, Russian and Japanese alike, the bombed-out houses, the flaming wreckages of armored vehicles that scattered the ash-laced snow. And then he stopped. Your doctrine is a pale imitation of what our marshal developed. And it shows with your losses that even after nearly 15 years of working together, you don't quite understand what we have taught you. He looked up to the sky, where Russian-manufactured Bf-109s licensed from Germany took a victory lap as if to prove his point for him, and sighed. No, every time you win, they say, the Germans must have helped. Every time you lose, they say, even the Germans couldn't save them. That is the burden of your alliance with Berlin. Rommel stepped forward again. Enjoy the glory while you have it. But don't confuse survival with victory. Zhukov said nothing. His breath steamed in the cold, but he no longer felt the chill. Chapter 553, The Weight of Crowns. The Tsar's death had come rather suddenly after Bruno left his family's palace. He had lied when he said he had a year left to live. He had died before the end of winter. Though for the life of him, Bruno could not fathom how Nicholas had managed to appear so presentable at the gathering. He must have conjured every ounce of strength and had his best makeup artist conceal the truth from him and everyone else. The funeral was held in Peter and Paul Cathedral, within St. Petersburg. It was the traditional resting place for the members of the House of Romanov. Bruno remembered little of the ceremony. Only that he stood, silent and still, dressed in the full regalia of a Russian field marshal, a rank he had earned during the Revolution of 1905, when, as a foreign volunteer, he helped crush the first sparks of communism on Russian soil. It was a surreal experience. Bruno had fought so hard to save Nicholas and his house, and certainly he had received a better end in this life. Not only that, but his family still lived and still held power. But to see his efforts ultimately pass before his very eyes, it was something he didn't want to come to terms with. The world he was changing, the timeline it created, it still moved forward and took the souls within it the same as the one he had come from. By the end of the ceremony, Bruno had said his goodbyes properly. To a man he had once admired, to a man he had saved, to a man he had grown accustomed to, but never close. Alexei and Elsa stood before Bruno, the young boy dressed like the soldier he always wanted to be, but never could be because of his condition. His words were ultimately what awoke Bruno from his stupor. I wanted to thank you on my father's behalf. He said it 1,000 times to be sure, but he never once stopped admiring you and what you did for our family all those years ago. And in his final days, I had never seen the man so happy. Whatever you said to him in private that night, when he made us all aware of his condition, it made his death one that he did not regret. Bruno stirred and then said nothing. He did not know what to say, how to respond. He had seen the letter Nicholas left him. Its words still crossed his mind whenever he tore open another piece of parchment. Words that echoed a similar sentiment to what Alexei had just expressed. In the end, Bruno simply bowed his head and said what he wished he could say to Nicholas. Thank you, Your Majesty. Your words mean more to me than I can express. But forgive me, I need a moment to myself. Bruno then turned away and walked out of the cathedral, gaining some much-needed fresh air to properly clear his head. Elsa leaned in close to her husband and hugged him tightly, whispering in the Tsarevich's ears her thoughts. I have never seen my father so disheartened. Well, once I have, when Eric died. Alexei himself understood the heartbreak. He himself was still going through it. He had lost his father, and now the weight of the world fell upon his shoulders. Russia was still at war with Japan, and the troops in the field did not yet know their Tsar was dead. He would have to seize control after his coronation and navigate the den of wolves that would seek to destroy him. He did not have time to grieve, and neither did Bruno. For that, he felt a far greater understanding of what Bruno was going through than he ever would have been able to comprehend until this very moment. Alexei grabbed his wife's hand and comforted them with a gentle kiss. "He will be all right, love. Duty comes first. Your father knows this better than anyone, and now I know it too." Elsa did not argue, but the expression on her face was one of concern. As much as she loved and adored her father, she feared Alexei might try to emulate his behavior. And if that were the case, the gentle boy she had fallen in love with would have to die and be replaced with a wolf, or worse, a bear. The unburnt banner of the German Reich now flew above Iwo Jima. Tens of thousands of German Marines had landed on the island, supported by 5,000 German paratroopers. If not for German amphibious warfare doctrine and the use of special operations forces to dismantle Japanese fortifications prior to the contested landing, along with others behind enemy lines harassing Japanese soldiers and supply lines further inland, it would have been a meat grinder of the most mythic proportions. But the Germans had adapted to amphibious assaults quite expertly. For a nation whose dedicated marine component dated its founding back to 1915, they had advanced decades ahead of the rest of the world in terms of doctrine. Amphibious armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and light tanks drove directly from the assault ship to the shores, carrying men and firepower with them. From there, they dismantled enemy fortifications and dropped their infantry components, allowing full-scale assault and protection. The Japanese had little to counter the advanced weapons and tactics the Germans used, and the last of the volcano islands fell into German hands a day after Russia had seized Seoul in the Korean peninsula. From here, Germany and its Luftwaffe could begin the bombardment of Okinawa and the Japanese mainland. All the while, the Russians would do the same after they seized Busan. 2 more battles needed to be waged for Japan's forces to be fully trapped on the mainland. And when that occurred, surrender was the logical option. But with the death of their emperor a year prior, and the refusal to surrender even after total defeat becoming a norm, Russian and German leadership alike began to fear the possibility that this war would not end unless the Japanese mainland as a whole was invaded. And if that came to pass, the cost would be measured not in victories, but in millions of lives. Chapter 554, The Council of Allies. Spring, 1932. The embers of Seoul still glowed beneath a sky dimmed by weeks of smoke and ash, yet already the machinery of power had resumed its endless motion. The war had not ended, and neither had duty. Bruno von Zehntner stood at the edge of the great map table in the temporary command center constructed on the outskirts of Vladivostok. He and many others among both the German Strategic High Command and that of their Russian allies found it necessary to relocate closer to the front for the final days of the war. The walls were lined with hastily constructed beams, the scent of fresh cut wood still clinging to the cold air. Outside, the banners of the German Empire flanked those of Imperial Russia. Inside, a war council was taking shape. Alexei Romanov sat at the table's head, flanked by senior Russian generals, German field marshals, and political attaches. His face was pale but composed. This would be his first attempt at partaking in a war his father had entered on their allies' behalf, a war his father had passed away halfway through. The weight on his shoulders was monumental, and he did not quite know how to handle it. He wore a uniform reminiscent of his father's, one that reminded Bruno of the late Tsar himself. Younger, inexperienced, but willing to do what was right and necessary for the sake of his people. "His Majesty thanks you for your attendance," one of the Russian generals began, his voice thick with formality, but Alexei raised a hand. "Let us speak plainly," the Tsarevich said. "We stand on the edge of final victory, but it must not come at the cost of our future." There was a silence at that, the kind of silence only raw truth could summon. Bruno leaned forward. "Then we agree." Alexei turned to him. "My father trusted you more than he trusted many in his own government. He told me you would advise me fairly. I ask for that now. not as a boy seeking comfort, but as a sovereign preparing to finish a war. The young man's words echoed with steel. There was no mistaking it now. Whatever childish softness had once clung to Alexei's manner was gone. Grief had burned it away. What remained was iron. The fall of Seoul and Iwo Jima, Bruno began, turning to the assembled officers, has brought us to the threshold. But the threshold of what? Victory? Or a protracted, attritional nightmare? Rommel, seated further down the table with a map folder still smudged with ash, cleared his throat. We both know what the Japanese are. They won't surrender. Not unless we break them utterly. And even then, they may refuse out of spite, added a Russian general. Their code forbids surrender. Alexei shook his head. Then we force them into a position where surrender is no longer dishonor, but mercy. Bruno nodded slightly. There it was again. The faint gleam of something worthy in the boy. Something dangerously close to idealism. But not naivete. No, he was calculating. Okinawa and Busan, Bruno continued. If we take them both, Japan loses its ability to maintain any semblance of a forward military position. The islands become launch pads. Their heartland becomes a target. We must strike fast, Alexei said, before internal instability slows us. My coronation is not yet complete. My voice will not carry forever. You want to join assault? Bruno asked. Yes. The room murmured. There had been coordination between German and Russian forces before. But this would be something far greater, a unified command structure for one final push. You realize, Bruno said carefully, that Berlin will want guarantees. You may speak on their behalf, Alexei said. I will offer what must be offered. The German attaches whispered among themselves. Rommel glanced up at Bruno and gave the faintest shrug, as if to say, he's your problem now. Then let us talk terms, Bruno said. They drew closer to the table. The map of East Asia sprawled before them. Lines marked German amphibious divisions, Russian armored thrusts, Japanese redoubts. Bruno pointed. Germany leads the assault on Okinawa, Russia on Busan. We establish forward operating bases within a week. We link by naval and air superiority. Your Black Sea fleet has proven itself, but we can extend supply lines by U-boat and support cruisers. Our bombers will soften targets beforehand, Rommel added. Precision strikes. We avoid cities, minimize casualties. Alexei seemed tense. No firebombing. The civilians need not suffer because of the foolishness of their leadership. Bruno paused. He had never been one to prioritize mitigation of civilian casualties when it came to pursuit of total victory. If the Japanese refused to surrender, he had the means to force their hand. In theory, he could go the same route the Americans had during the Pacific theater of the Second World War in his past life. But that would immediately spark a nuclear arms race and make the coming Second World War in this timeline all the more egregious. No, he had been stockpiling millions of thermobaric and chemical weapons as a series of deterrents against an invasion of the German homeland, something only he truly knew about. Fully tested, fully capable of being launched on Japan's mainland. The problem would become whether or not these devastating strikes would embolden the Japanese resolve or break it entirely. Still, with the expressions his counterparts were making, Bruno sighed heavily and shook his head. Agreed, we should try to mitigate as much damage to the civilian population as possible. But make no mistake, no war was ever won without collateral damage. It is a terrible reality you will have to understand if you wish to win this war, Your Majesty. To deny this fact would be to put your own people in danger and make the conflict far bloodier and last far longer than it needs to be. There was a long pause. Nobody had wanted to tell the Tsarevich, who had yet to wear his father's crown, the harsh truth of warfare. With their advanced technological capability and total air supremacy, they felt that perhaps they might be able to maintain the illusion of a civilized war for a bit longer. However, Bruno was not a man to mince words and maintain lies for the sake of comfort. This was war, not a knitting contest, and Alexei needed to know the truth. No matter how they proceeded, civilians would die. Alexei stood still, sucking in the cold spring air of Vladivostok through his teeth. Finally, understanding why Bruno had been the way he always was. The man was a soldier who experienced some of the most brutal wars in human history firsthand. It forged his mentality into steel, and he knew that if he were to endure what was to come, he too would need to harden his resolve. Very well, I understand. We will try to end this with as much decency as we can manage. But if the Japanese force our hands, there will be no choice but to unleash hell upon them, and they will only have their own leadership to blame for our cruelty. Draw the orders. Present them to me by tomorrow. I will sign them in my father's name and mine. The meeting adjourned. Slowly, the room emptied. Bruno remained. So did Alexei. Only once they were alone did the young Tsarevich exhale and allow the weight to settle upon his shoulders. Bruno watched him for a moment, then approached. Your father would have approved, he said quietly. Alexei looked up. I don't know if I can live as he did. You can't, Bruno replied. You're not him, and the world you inherit is not his. This world is changing, Alexei, and it is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. What we do here today will lay the foundations for what is to come, and with that in mind, I need you to be strong. Your family, your nation need you to be strong. The boy nodded. Then his eyes darkened. Will they obey me when I am crowned? Bruno didn't lie. Some will, some won't. That is the nature of power. But command isn't granted. It's taken, and you have to hold it with both hands. Alexei stood again, straighter now. Then I will. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again. Softly, quietly, as if even winter itself waited for the future to begin. Chapter 555. Embers of the Rising Sun. The sky over Okinawa was choked with the acrid scent of cordite and ash. Shells pounded the earth with a thunder that felt biblical, even to veterans of this long war. For 3 days prior, the Luftwaffe had softened coastal defenses with precise strikes. Fuel depots, bunkers, radar stations, and artillery emplacements reduced to smoldering ruin. The assault began at dawn. Amphibious assault craft, engineered from the modular hulls of the German armored doctrine, surged forward with blunt purpose. Each one carried not only infantry but entire squads of mechanized armor. Amphibious IFVs with mounted 30mm autocannons, smoke dispensers, and slat armor. Among the first to make landfall were the 3rd Kaiser Marine Infantry Division and the elite 7th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, whose paratroopers had dropped out of planes over the contested island. They moved in tandem, seizing beachheads and fortifications further inland with terrifying efficiency. Resistance was brutal but desperate. Japanese defenders, dug into a honeycomb of tunnels and fortified bunkers, emerged with suicidal tenacity. Grenade belts, satchel charges, and desperate bayonet charges followed the path of falling artillery like vultures trailing a wildfire. A German captain leading the 3 RD Division's forward armored spear recorded in his field notes. They came from the earth like ghosts. But not even ghosts can stand against steel and fire. They died for a home already lost. By nightfall, half the island's southern coast was in German hands. With aerial reconnaissance feeding information live via radio broadcasts to frontline commanders, the German doctrine of high-speed envelopment was in full force. Platoons maneuvered not by map, but by minute-to-minute radio communication. Still, casualties were not light. Dozens of IFVs burned in the surf. The bodies of young Marines lay scattered where shellfire had caught them in the open. But war was never bloodless, and the advance continued without relent. The battle would not be quick, but it would be decisive. At the same time, the Russian campaign for Busan was not as elegant. It was a hammer strike, brutal, efficient, and soaked in blood. Major General Zhukov, acting commander of the Far Eastern Front, directed the assault from a forward command post embedded in the hills northwest of the city. Unlike the Germans, who had spent years refining the modular fusion of armor and air, the Russians were still learning by doing, and bleeding in the process. Joint military exercises and the exchange of cadets could only do so much to prepare Russian strategic thinkers for the new era of warfare. They had the tools and the resources, but not the foresight to truly understand how to win a war without bleeding for it first. As a result, the 5th White Army spearheaded the advance in support from domestically produced Panzer II medium tanks and German-licensed self-propelled artillery based on the same chassis. The attack was preceded by a 12-hour artillery barrage that leveled entire sectors of the outer city. The Russians surged in with flamethrowers, mechanized infantry, and overwhelming numbers. Busan was defended by a veteran Japanese garrison determined to fight to the last man. sniper nests, scorched trenches, and hidden IEDs littered every street. A Russian colonel leading a battalion of Siberian infantry through the industrial district described the carnage. The city screamed, not in voices, but in the metal that bent and burned. We buried brothers in the ash between steel beams and broken glass. Unlike Okinawa, there was no clean thrust, no surgical strikes. It was a house-to-house purge. Civilians who had not fled were caught in the inferno. But the Russians were relentless. After 5 days of nonstop combat, Busan fell. The last remnants of the Japanese forces detonated their supply depot in a final blaze of defiance, killing hundreds. The flames smoldered for hours. Even the Russians, hardened by winter campaigns and purges, fell silent as the smoke rose into the morning. Among the ruins, a mother clutched the charred remains of her child, screaming not in Japanese, but in perfect Russian. She had once been married to a Russian merchant, long before the war. Now, none could tell which side she belonged to. War had erased the difference. Only silence remained in the wake of her grief. Tokyo. The Imperial War Cabinet sat in a fortified basement beneath the Kanti. Maps adorned every wall, but they were no longer battle plans. They were obituaries. The Korean peninsula was gone. The southern archipelago lost. Okinawa, once the last bastion, was now a staging ground for German bombers. Admiral Yamamuro stared at the map and said what none dared admit aloud. We are surrounded. The room was quiet save for the rustling of reports. Civilian morale was crumbling. Supply lines were strangled by submarine warfare. There were whispers of famine in the rural prefectures. But surrender? If we surrender now, said General Kuroda, voice low and venomous, then all those who died before, at Kyoto, Seoul, Osaka, even Hiroshima, they died for nothing. Emperor Taisho will be remembered by the people as a man that started a war which broke the empire. This cannot be. If we do not surrender, replied a soft but thunderous voice through his envoy, then everyone still alive dies next. It was the voice of the new emperor. He did not speak often, and when he did, it was never with theatrics. But in that moment, there was something in his words that cut deeper than any sword the samurai had ever carried. The officers around the table lowered their heads, not out of obedience, but recognition. The age of glory had passed. What lay ahead was only survival. Hirohito did not wear the crown. In this life, he had died shortly after his father's death in the struggle that came from various factions within the imperial palace. Rather, his brother, Yasuhito, now reigned as the Emperor of Japan. His words were deafening, and the room remained silent for some time. But ultimately this did not persist long as there was talk of a last stand. Of flooding Tokyo's tunnels with the Imperial Guard. Of training women and children with sharpened bamboo spears. A scorched earth defense of the homeland. But for the first time, even the most zealous saw the flicker of inevitability. The Reich and the Tsardom had won the skies, and they had seized the waves. And beneath those skies, and among those waves, Japan truly stood alone. Chapter 556, Back in the Game. The shores of Okinawa still smoldered with the bitter musk of war. The wreckage of bunkers, charred supply depots, shattered helmets, and the sickly sweet scent of blood-soaked earth all conspired to perfume the air with victory and its price. Bruno stepped down from the ramp of his personal transport. The tarmac was practically steaming from the Pacific heat. It was hot enough that Bruno half expected his boots to melt if he lingered too long. He closed his eyes for a moment and inhaled. The air was thick, warm, heavy with cordite and the faint aftertaste of firebombs. Ah, he murmured, his tone almost wistful. Smells like victory. Smells like dysentery, heat stroke, and poor life choices, came a voice behind him. Heinrich, ever reluctant, ever loyal, clambered down with far less grace. He tugged at his collar, wiped sweat from his brow with a grease-stained sleeve, and took a long swig from his dented silver flask. You know, Heinrich grumbled, I was just starting to enjoy life behind a desk. Bureaucracy was finally making sense. Paperwork doesn't bleed. Bruno chuckled, not out of mirth, but recognition. You were becoming fat and slow. This'll be good for you. I'm going to get malaria. Or trench foot. Probably both. Bruno didn't reply. He took a few steps forward, his boots crunching across bullet casings. The battle had ended hours ago. The smell had not. Around them, soldiers from the 3rd Kaisermarine Division were performing the grim theater of aftermath, hauling wounded, covering bodies, extinguishing the final traces of resistance. They passed a medic patching up a man whose leg was torn down to the bone. The soldier screamed through clenched teeth. The medic didn't flinch. Heinrich looked away. Bruno kept walking. See what I mean? If this was Isanzo, you wouldn't have flinched at the sight of such brutality. Silence remained as the inland airstrip came into view over the rise, a testament to German engineering discipline under fire. It had been assembled in mere days, bulldozed and cleared by combat engineers who worked while mortars still screamed overhead. And on it, a fleet. Bruno stopped, arms folded, as the sight unfolded before them. Dornier du 217th lined the runways in perfect formation, their splinter-patterned fuselages scorched and patched, but airworthy. Engines idled with a growl like chained wolves. Twin tails rose like specters above rows of mechanics, who moved with practiced rhythm, refueling, reloading, replacing. Next to them, a dozen squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf 109s gleamed under the rising sun, their wings bearing the Iron Cross in black and white. They looked predatory even at rest. Bruno exhaled slowly. It begins soon. Heinrich handed him the flask without asking. Bruno took a sip. Something strong. Cherry? No. Plum. Russian-made. You think they'll break through the mainland defenses? Heinrich asked, nodding toward the bombers. They don't have to break through. Just make a hole wide enough to bleed them. Groups of pilots gathered nearby, seated on empty munition crates or leaning against their planes. Their uniforms were rumpled, stained in sweat and ash. Some smoked, others checked gear or maps. All were silent. None bore the vacant stare of shell shock. None twitched with nerves. They weren't reckless. They weren't invincible. But they were dialed in. There was a terrifying calm about them. Focused. Cold. Like chess masters before the opening move. One of them, a young Hauptmann with oil streaks on his jaw and a Luftwaffe scarf tied loosely around his neck, looked up and nodded at Bruno. Not out of deference. Recognition. Bruno nodded back. A siren blared briefly in the distance, a test signal. Somewhere, an officer barked orders. Ground crews moved with renewed urgency. They know the next raid won't be like the last, Heinrich muttered. The Japanese know they're cornered, Bruno replied. They'll fight as though death is a blessing. And we'll oblige them, Heinrich muttered. He took another swig. Bruno turned his eyes to the horizon. Past the jagged silhouette of torched trees and broken hills, the sea shimmered. There, in the harbor, lay the Pacific Fleet. Its losses were minimal over the years, but it had been reinforced. More and more advanced warships replaced the aging vessels of the High Seas Fleet. Sitting proudly atop the sea and its waves were cruisers, based on the Admiral Hipper class from Bruno's past life. Four of them the Hindenburg, von Moltke, Siegfried, and Dornier. Sleek monsters of steel and firepower, their decks crawling with broadside guns and the flak turrets to protect them. Escort destroyers circled them like loyal hounds. At the fleet's center loomed the crown jewel of Bruno's naval doctrine, a supercarrier. Its hull, originally drawn from the Graf Zeppelin blueprint of his past life, had been reimagined, lengthened, widened, and reinforced to house over 100 aircraft across multiple hangar decks. But such a Leviathan could not be powered by mere diesel or steam. No, it drank from the fire of the coming age, an experimental nuclear reactor buried deep within its armored belly, shielded in tungsten and lead. The heat it produced could boil oceans. The energy it supplied made it sovereign on the sea. It was more than a ship, it was a herald, a floating continent, the first of its kind, and perhaps, in Bruno's eyes, the first of many. Every one of them bristled with activity. Flight crews signaled, deck officers shouted, cranes swung ordnance into place. Operation Dameroon, Bruno murmured. The twilight before the sun sets. Heinrich frowned. Romantic name for mass murder. Bruno turned. You think there's anything romantic left in this war? Just enough to keep poets miserable, Heinrich said, dragging his coat tighter. A runner approached, saluted. Herr von Zehntner, General Feldmarschall von Mackensen requests your presence in the command dugout. He says it's urgent. Bruno nodded. Tell him I'm on my way. The boy sprinted off. Heinrich looked up. Back to the chessboard, then. We never left it. They made their way toward the forward command post, skirting between bombers and tanks, past crews checking avionics and belts of high explosive shells. Around them, the war machine of the Reich spun back to life, preparing for one final act of annihilation. Bruno walked tall, coat fluttering like a banner, eyes fixed ahead. Heinrich followed, the flask tucked back into his coat, grumbling, as always. Above them, one of the Do-217s began to taxi down the runway. Its engines roared. Its wheels lifted. It climbed into the ash-streaked sky. War was returning to the skies of Japan. Chapter 557, The Death of the Old Guard. The command bunker was a squat, reinforced concrete shell half buried into the red earth, disguised under a camouflage net, and surrounded by freshly dug trenches lined with sandbags. It was neither elegant nor particularly secure, but it served its purpose, close enough to the front to remain informed, but not so close as to be obliterated by Japanese artillery. Bruno ducked under the low entrance and was greeted by the acrid stench of sweat, engine oil, and burning paper. Inside, the air was thick and hot, the lights dimmed to preserve night vision. Field phones buzzed. Radio operators murmured into headsets. Maps were pinned to every available surface, marked, crossed out, rewritten again. At the far end of the bunker, standing ramrod straight in his black piped gray uniform, was the lion of the old world, General Feldmarschall August von Mackensen. Bruno had grown used to seeing men decline with age, but Mackensen, well into his 80s, still carried himself like a hussar from a forgotten era. His posture had bent slightly with time, and the once iron voice had softened to a gravelly echo, but the aura remained. A man carved from duty and drilled by war. Field Marshal, Bruno said, offering a crisp salute. Mackensen returned it, then waved the gesture off. Save that for the Kaiser. I'm far too old to keep playing dress-up. Bruno stepped closer, noting how much weight the old man had lost. His once regal mustache had grayed completely, though it remained waxed with Prussian precision. You summon me, sir? Mackensen nodded toward the map table. Yes, Okinawa is in our hands, but the next step must be planned. Sit. Bruno took a seat beside him. The table was a mess of elevation models, pinned photos, flight paths. A glass of warm mineral water sat untouched beside Mackensen's cane. I've read your proposals, the old man said, tapping a finger against a folder marked Marang. They are brutal, calculated, necessary, and I approve. Not that my approval matters much anymore. Mackensen sighed, turning his gaze to the bunker's wall, as if trying to look past it, to the sea, to Europe, to a past that was rapidly turning to dust. This will be my last war, he muttered. A pity it wasn't fought in defense of the fatherland, but out here, in these dreadful tropics. Bruno said nothing. There was no comfort to give. The weight of Mackensen's words hung heavy. The Kaiser's sons, Mackensen continued. They think I'm a fossil. Maybe I am. I've fought 3 wars now, across 2 centuries. I remember the Balkans before the Slavs tore it apart. I remember Austria before her bones were picked clean. And now I sit here, 70 kilometers from the Japanese homeland, planning the end of an empire I once never thought we'd even face. He coughed into a cloth. A few specks of green phlegm stained it. Bruno pretended not to notice. I didn't want this, Mackensen confessed. I wanted to die in Silesia, in peace, in a chair, with my grandchildren at my feet and a book on my lap. But instead, I'll die here, in a sweat-soaked concrete box surrounded by telegraph cables and the smell of dead men. You won't die here, Bruno said quietly. In fact, I think you will live another decade in the peaceful retirement you have earned. The old man chuckled. Oh, it's a funny thing, the way people speak of you. It's as if you have always known the future and prepare perfectly for its approach. If what you say is true, I'll die a believer. Bruno chuckled as he shook his head. Maybe I am, maybe I'm not. As far as I'm concerned, I'm just a man who had a duty to protect his family, folk, and fatherland. And so I have always strived my best in this regard, with or without knowledge of the future seared into my brain. That earned a proper laugh, hoarse and pained, but genuine. You are going to deny this until I'm buried beneath the earth, aren't you? He straightened, refocusing. The Japanese will not surrender from air raids alone. Their heart still beats. It must be cut out. And that means Kyushu. Bruno nodded. We begin with strikes on their remaining radar installations. Then airfields. Supply depots. Their navy has no capital ships left. Our carrier group is fully fueled. The Reich is ready. And the Russians? Alexei is still gathering strength. Seoul was a heavy toll. Busan was worse. But he'll come. He has something to prove. Mackinson grunted. He has a throne to prove worthy of. That kind of man is dangerous. But perhaps that's what the world needs. Another bear in the east, to keep the wolves at bay. He looked down, his fingers resting on a photograph clipped to the map, a reconnaissance image of Kyushu, marked with targets and risk assessments. His gaze lingered. You know, Mackinson said slowly, we never meant for this world to look like this. After Paris, we thought there would be peace. Or at least, predictability. That's why it failed, Bruno replied. They fought to survive. We're fighting to shape. The old marshal gave him a sideways look. That's the difference, is it? Between survival and ambition. It always has been. The room fell quiet again. The only sounds were the rustle of maps and the occasional static crackle of the radios. Outside, a bomber's engines roared to life. After a long silence, Mackinson spoke again. His voice had taken on a weariness Bruno hadn't heard before, not exhaustion, but resolution. Promise me one thing. Anything. When I go, don't waste soldiers on pomp. No parade. No cannon salute. I want a letter sent to my son, and my medals melted down for the next batch of Iron Crosses. Bruno hesitated. You'll have a place in the Hall of Heroes. I don't want marble. I want memory. Let me be a story fathers tell their sons when they wonder what duty looks like. Bruno stood. I can do that. Mackinson extended a frail but firm hand. Bruno took it, and for a moment, past and future locked in a silent pact. Then go, Mackinson said. Prepare the thunder. I'll be here when the fire starts. But don't wait for me. Bruno saluted again, this time without shame. He turned and made for the exit. As he reached the doorway, he looked back once. Mackinson had returned to the map, tracing a finger across the southern shores of Japan, muttering softly to himself. A man born in the age of cavalry, commanding the death blow in the atomic era. Outside, the sky had darkened. Bombers began to rise from the tarmac one by one, engines howling. Bruno squinted into the sun as a silhouette passed overhead. A Do-217, fully loaded, headed north. Operation Damarung had begun, and the twilight before the final darkness had fallen. Chapter 558, The Beginning of the World's End. The first bombing raids from Okinawa began at dawn. Do-217s rose into the sky in tight V formations, escorted by packs of Messerschmitt Bf-109s that climbed higher still, like hawks riding the cold currents above the Pacific. Their engines snarled through thin air, exhaling black smoke trails that stitched the heavens with grim portents. From the ground below, on the fishing hamlets and naval yards of southern Kyushu, the sound arrived first as a distant, rolling growl, like thunder crawling across the horizon, hesitating before it struck. By the time the Japanese anti-air batteries spotted them, it was too late. Shells blossomed in ragged black puffs all around the bombers, but the flak was scattered, uncoordinated. Japanese crews were firing blind. Radar installations had been systematically destroyed by German saboteurs landed weeks earlier. Fire control was improvised, desperate. And the German pilots, they did not waver. And somewhere near Kagoshima, farmers stood by their rice paddies, mouths open, straw hats in hand, as the squadrons roared overhead. A grandmother clutching two toddlers dropped to her knees in the mud, wailing a prayer. Not 30 seconds later, the earth shook as bombs fell across the coastal shipyards, smashing slipways and fuel reserves into smoldering ruin. Storage tanks ruptured in bright, orange geysers. Oil ran through the streets, carrying flame with it. A dock destroyer, its crew scrambling with buckets in hand, split apart under the force of two direct hits. Its midsection belched smoke and then cracked in half like dry wood. A young Japanese sailor, barely 16, stood on the deck as the stern capsized. He tried to scream, but his mouth filled with seawater. He was gone before he realized he was dying. In a bunker outside Miyazaki, Imperial General Kuroda sat hunched over a shaking table, white gloves stained with ink and sweat. Reports came in by the minute. Coastal batteries overrun. Barracks crushed under precision strikes. Civilian panic in every prefecture south of Fukuoka. A junior officer stood at attention, helmet under one arm, eyes dark with sleepless terror. "Sir, the local garrison is requesting permission to initiate general mobilization of civilian militias." Kuroda did not look up. He merely pressed his gloved hand to his forehead and exhaled long through his teeth. "So the time has come to arm children and old men. The sons of the emperor will have their final harvest." He scribbled his authorization and waved the officer off. Outside the bunker, the ground rumbled again. Dust sifted down from the beams overhead. Somewhere in the distance, another fuel depot erupted, sending up a roiling column of black smoke that twisted through the gray morning sky. Above Kyushu, a German Luftwaffe captain adjusted his oxygen mask, fingers slick with sweat inside his flight gloves. His Do-217 was stacked with 2 tons of ordnance, half high explosive, half incendiary. Through his canopy, he could see dozens more bombers in echelon formation, their silhouettes grim and steady. Radio chatter was sparse. Each man was alone with his own thoughts. Alone with the realization that this was the heartland, not some colonial port or island garrison. This was Japan proper. "Bomb bays open," his bombardier called out, voice scratchy through the intercom. The captain's throat worked. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he pressed the switch. Below, neat city blocks unrolled like a lattice of fragile straw mats. The bombs fell away in staggered drops, vanishing beneath the fuselage with mechanical precision. Seconds stretched into hours. Then the first impacts rolled up through the hull, muffled, monstrous, like giants slamming the earth with iron hammers. Tokyo, War Ministry. The conference room was heavy with the sour scent of fear. Admiral Yamamuro and 3 staff colonels bent over a table crowded with pins and lines that no longer meant anything. Every coastal garrison south of Hiroshima was either cut off or on fire. A low-ranking adjutant burst through the doors, bowing so deeply his forehead nearly touched the polished floor. "Honored sirs, a telegram from Kagoshima has arrived. The western yards are gone. Half the fishing fleet has been requisitioned for military transport. The other half burns in the harbor. Civilians are fleeing north without orders." Yamamuro said nothing for a long time. His eyes roved over the map, seeing nothing. Finally, he whispered, almost to himself, "We are an island, and the sea has betrayed us." In the fields outside Nagasaki, a farmer's boy stood barefoot on a dirt ridge, his hands stained with rice stalks. He watched the sky, mouth parted in awe. Above, BF-109s wheeled like metallic swallows, diving on scattered anti-air positions. Their cannons chattered, and tracer lines cut brilliant threads through the morning haze. One Japanese flak gun tried to traverse to meet them. A Messerschmitt broke from its wingman, Dove, and in a blur of motion stitched the emplacement with explosive shells, men scattered in pieces. The boy didn't scream. He simply clutched his hoe tighter, eyes wide and dry. Somewhere deep inside, a voice he didn't know he possessed whispered, "The gods are leaving us." On board the supercarrier Wilhelm I, Bruno watched the reports come in from his command tower, his face carved from granite. A young naval signals officer, barely older than Bruno's youngest sons, brought him another stack of decoded intercepts. The boy was pale. His hands trembled as he saluted. "Thank you," Bruno said simply, his voice cutting through the tension. The youth withdrew, leaving him alone with the ever-growing mountain of confirmation. Okinawa had not been a culmination. It was only the opening of the vice. Now, Japan truly felt the iron hand closing around its throat. Beside him, Heinrich pulled out his battered flask again. "So it begins," he muttered. Bruno did not take his eyes off the horizon, where new waves of bombers lifted from the carrier's deck, their engines roaring with dreadful promise. "It's already begun." Bruno did not speak further. He simply handed the letter over to Heinrich, whose eyes bulged in disbelief as he double-checked its contents, and then triple-checked them. "What the hell is this? This is utter madness. They can't be serious." Bruno sighed, reaching for a nearby pack of cigarettes, which lay abandoned on the desk. He struck a match and took a long drag, exhaling the sweet nicotine he had denied himself for the better course of nearly 2 decades. Alexei's hopes of sparing civilians were noble, almost painfully so, but he never understood the Japanese mind. When the homeland is threatened, there are no civilians, only war. Heinrich stared at the paper. It took a heartbeat too long to understand, and when he did, his eyes didn't widen from surprise, but from horror. You can't possibly mean. Bruno put the cigarette out in the nearby ashtray that was full of other spent devices like it. His face was as expressionless as a monolith as his voice carried the weight of 1,000,000 souls yet to perish. If this is the war they want, I will give it to them. And I will conduct it the same way I have endeavored to fight every battle in my life. We will fight until the very last, but it will not be our blood spent on the shores of Japan. Let the world understand this truth. It is better that the Reich be feared than respected, if it cannot be both. I think it is about time we deploy our strategic arsenal. Heinrich's hand trembled as he lifted the receiver. When he set it down, neither man spoke. The silence was not peaceful. It was the stillness before a guillotine drops. This is General Oberst Heinrich von Koch, under the orders of His Royal Majesty General Feldmarschall Bruno von Zehntner, authorization for deployment of missile forces in Okinawa to strike the following targets: Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya. That is all, over and out. Silence persisted between the two men as Bruno lit another cigarette and smoked it without the slightest trace of emotion on his face. He looked over at his watch and saw the amount of time that had passed before putting it out like he had the one before. It is about time. Shall we go watch the fireworks? Heinrich's expression turned stern as he followed after Bruno, who had already begun to depart. That isn't funny. Bruno's voice was filled with a somber and lamentable tone as he exited the carrier's hull and stood upon the deck, pulling out a pair of binoculars as he looked into the distance. It wasn't supposed to be. On the island of Okinawa, sirens blared across the island. But this was not the alarm raised in anticipation of an enemy attack. No, it was something unique that spurred every hand on the island to jump into position and frantically get to work. On the shores, heavy trucks rumbled into place, each cradling a missile under canvas and steel. As crews scrambled around them, the launch systems hummed to life, their guidance systems working in tandem as they calculated the arc and trajectory needed to hit their targets with precision. And then they fired. Hundreds of missiles shot straight into the air and turned towards the Japanese mainland. The missiles split off into 3 separate directions mid-air, barreling straight towards their targets, and then came the explosions, each one producing a mushroom cloud, smaller than the ones dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Bruno's past life, but no less fierce in their fire. The cities Heinrich had listed were struck by the missiles, each of their payload on par with 44 tons of TNT. And when Heinrich gazed upon the destruction in the distance, he could help but shield his eyes and turn away. What in the name of God? Bruno, however, continued to look at the fires burn in the distance and the mushroom clouds disperse. All the while his face and tone were as cold as ice. Thermobaric air-burst warheads, fired from medium-range ballistic missile platforms. This is just a small sample of what I have been preparing for the world should they dare to invade the fatherland with any serious intent. Unfortunately for the Japanese, they managed to provoke their use earlier than intended. Heinrich said nothing. He could say nothing. He just understood, with a clarity that struck like ice in his gut. This was not the end of Japan. This was the beginning of the world's end. Chapter 559, A Graveyard of Compromises. Busan, May 1932. The city burned, not in the sharp detonations of precise German bombardment, but in the ragged, clumsy swaths of Russian artillery fire and block-by-block incineration. Smoke crawled low across twisted rebar skeletons. Chunks of masonry still tumbled from battered high-rises. Here and there, a wall collapsed inward with a low, groaning sigh, as if the city itself was finally succumbing to exhaustion. Major General Georgy Zhukov stood atop the shell-ravaged terrace of a commandeered customs building, peering through field glasses at the port below. Russian soldiers were already raising their tricolor on what was left of the Busan Harbor Administration building. Around him, staff officers spoke in low, eager tones. The voices of men who knew victory, who felt it tasted like blood and soot in their lungs. Zhukov lowered the binoculars and exhaled through his nose. His mustache twitched with irritation. "These fools," he muttered. "We've won ourselves a graveyard. No more, no less." A colonel nearby cleared his throat, gesturing to a courier sprinting across the rooftop. The boy's coat was torn at the shoulder, his eyes too wide to be calm. "Message from Vladivostok headquarters, General." Zhukov ripped open the packet. His eyes scanned the telegram. His brow furrowed, then smoothed in an unreadable line. Inside the makeshift headquarters, Tsarevich Alexei Romanov stood over a map table scarred by bayonets and cigarette burns. Around them clustered senior Russian staff, their greatcoats dusted with Korean plaster. A single bulb swung overhead, casting long, nervous shadows. When Zhukov entered, boots crunching over broken glass, Alexei looked up with the relief of a man who desperately needed certainty. "Busan is ours," Zhukov announced, with none of the triumph such words deserved. Japanese forces fought to the last. It was a slaughter. What remains of their garrison fled inland or died in their bunkers. Alexei's shoulders fell a fraction. How many civilians were caught in the encirclement? Zhukov's stare was flat. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. The city refused evacuation orders, or they never received them. Hard to know which. Our artillery had no choice. Alexei's knuckles whitened on the table edge. "And the losses among your own?" he asked. Zhukov's jaw tightened. "High, but within expectations. Russian lives are cheaper than time, Your Majesty. We bleed so we do not stall." Alexei exhaled slowly. A shadow of old frailty crossed his face, but then he drew himself upright again. "Then prepare them. I want your men rested, reorganized, and re-equipped. In 3 weeks we embark for the Japanese home islands." Zhukov inclined his head stiffly. "As you command." He turned to leave, then paused, fishing the crumpled telegram from his pocket. "There is another matter. From the German lines on Okinawa. It arrived just after we secured the city." He handed it to Alexei. The Tsarevich took it with faint surprise. As he read, his face drained of color, not fear, but a gathering storm. He read it again, slower. The words seemed to etch themselves into the pale skin beneath his eyes. Finally, he spoke, voice low, cold, almost brittle. "It appears General Feldmarschall von Zehntner has authorized strategic missile strikes on Japanese industrial centers." Zhukov simply raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Alexei's hand clenched into a fist. Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, all hit within hours. Thermobaric airbursts. Entire districts flattened and turned to glass. Civilians vaporized alongside foundries and munitions plants. He looked up, eyes blazing. Without a single word to his ally. No consultation. No coordination. "We are supposed to be brothers in arms, yet he treats us like children to be humored." Zhukov gave a humorless laugh. "The Germans always did think they carried civilization on their shoulders. Now they carry apocalypse." Alexei stepped back from the table. For a moment, it looked as though he might collapse. Instead, he planted both hands on the battered wood, breathing hard. "Prepare a formal protest. To be sent to Berlin and directly to my father-in-law. I will not have Russian arms labeled complicit in the slaughter of Japanese civilians. If we are to destroy the empire of Japan, we will do it by the sword, not by the blind terror of firestorms from the sky." Zhukov's eyes narrowed. "With respect, Your Majesty, this was inevitable. We plan to invade Kyushu ourselves. How many civilians will our artillery kill when they shelter beneath every roof? This way, perhaps, the Germans have spared us the burden." Alexei shot him a glare sharp as ice. "They have spared us nothing. They have ensured our children's children will inherit a world where such monstrous weapons are considered an acceptable prelude to conquest." Alexei's mouth tightened into a thin line. "Then I will remind him that Russia is no junior partner in this alliance. When this war is over, he will find I am not a boy waiting for his father's approval." Outside, the streets of Busan were eerily quiet for a conquered city. Russian sentries stood at intersections, machine guns resting casually across their chests. Occasional trucks rumbled past, loaded with ammunition, water, and wide-eyed refugees. Above the skyline, distant on the southern horizon, faint orange smudges still marked the air, the last traces of mushrooming shockwaves rising over Japan's devastated industrial belt. Zhukov followed Alexei out onto a balcony that overlooked the harbor. The sea was littered with shattered junks and blackened cargo hulks. "Will this change our plans?" Zhukov asked finally. Alexei stared seaward, his profile rigid. No. The invasion proceeds. But tell your men this. Russia will not stand accused of butchery. We will seize our objectives by rifle and bayonet, not by glassing cities from the sky. If Bruno wants to wear the mantle of the world's nightmare, let him. Zhukov gave a slow nod. Understood. They stood in silence together a moment longer. The wind off the water smelled of salt and scorched timber. A gull circled overhead, screeching its lonesome cry over a harbor that had once been a living artery of commerce, now reduced to ruin. Rommel, having borne witness to the meeting and the young Tsarevka's outburst, found Alexei standing by the window, staring at a map of the Japanese archipelago pinned to the wall. Will you write to Bruno personally? His jaw worked. Yes, as both an ally and as a sovereign. He must understand there are lines Russia will not cross, even in war. Rommel's eyes hardened with warning. He will not care. Then he will learn, Alexei said quietly. One way or another. A slight sigh escaped Rommel's lips. As the attaché to the Russian army in Korea, he had two jobs, advising the Russians on how to properly wage warfare, and keeping an eye on the heir to the vacant throne. Alexei may be in his 30s, but he had grown up far away from the hardships of war and the gruesome challenges it prevented. Since Bruno could not personally mentor the man on such a subject, Rommel was tasked with doing so in his place. And thus his words quickly shifted to a paternal tone that Alexei had not heard since his father passed. I understand the importance you put on civilian lives, Your Majesty, but your general just said that the blood of your own people is cheap compared to victory. Time and time again I have advised the brute that marching straight into a meat grinder is not a form of supreme excellence. Rommel briefly went quiet, the scenes of Russian disregard for the lives of their own soldiers flooding his mind as he pinched the nose of the bridge, recomposing himself just in time to continue without interruption. Time and again, he dismisses my concerns. That is the difference between him and a man like Bruno. That is also the difference between you and Bruno. You see the death of civilians as an avoidable tragedy, but Bruno understands it is an unfortunate and permanent aspect of warfare. Rommel then fumbled through his pockets and retrieved a telegram given to him by the German troops embedded with him among Russian lines. He handed it over to Alexei without formality. I have received word from the fleet off the coast of Japan. The General Feldmarschall acted the way he did because the Imperial Japanese High Command issued the mobilization of their entire population. A deep breath and a narrowing of his eyes before continuing. Young boys and elderly men are being equipped with rifles, spears, and sharpened bamboo sticks. Women and girls are preparing to take their own lives to avoid befalling a tragedy that is little more than lies conjured by the Ministry of Propaganda. Rommel began to march forward, standing directly in front of Alexei, gazing directly into the man's wavering eyes, knowing in that moment he had already won. The man once known as the Desert Fox pressed for total victory. How many of our own men will die if we invade Japan under such circumstances? How many Japanese civilians will meet their end? What you call an act of barbarism and cruelty, we see as a necessary cost to prevent the further spread of violence and bloodshed. I'm going to have to formally request you withdraw your written statement of protest and pick up a phone and ask the General Feldmarschall himself if you still doubt my words. With this said, Rommel pivoted and left the room without saying another word. He didn't need to wait for a response, because he knew what it was before Alexei could even muster the thoughts to speak. Night fell on Busan in flickering patches. Fires still smoldered in the ruins, their glow reflecting off cold bay water. And beyond that dark horizon, on the battered remains of Japan's industrial heartland, the fires of Bruno's choosing still raged, brutal, efficient, and impossibly modern. The future they had all fought to build was arriving at last. But as Alexei Romanov would soon realize, it was a future no man could fully control. Chapter 560, A Hard Lesson Learned. The halls of the Imperial Ministry smelled of sweat and scorched lacquer, heavy with the dread of men who knew they were witnessing the final pages of their empire's long chronicle. Maps of the home islands lay scattered across broad polished tables, some edges charred where frantic officers had stubbed out cigarettes too close. Pin flags marked depots that no longer existed, divisions that no longer lived. And on a raised dais, under the silent portraits of emperors past, the war cabinet gathered. General Kuroda sat with his head bowed, the veins in his temples pulsing. Across from him, Admiral Yamamuro held a handkerchief over his mouth, as if to block out the stench of ruin carried on every breath. Osaka, Kuroda rasped finally. Kobe, Nagoya. 3 of our industrial lungs collapsed in a single hour. The arsenals are gone. The munitions warehouse, erased. Civilian districts, ash. An undersecretary, no older than 25, blurted out. The Ministry of Civil Affairs says the fires will take days to put out. Entire neighborhoods are vaporized. They can't even count the bodies. They're gone. Yamamuro slammed his fist down on the table, rattling ink pots. Silence. The young man flinched back, swallowing whatever terror had clawed up his throat. A thin voice came from the back of the chamber. Prince Kanan, skeletal now in his ceremonial uniform, eyes clouded with both age and dread. If we do not sue for peace, there will be nothing left to rule. Not even rubble. Only graves. Kuroda glared at him. And let the Germans dictate the terms of our extinction? No. If they want to take the sacred soil of Yamato, they will have to bleed for every stone. General, Yamamuro cut in, voice leaden. We have no factories to resupply the army. No dry dock to service the fleet. No fuel stockpiles left to shuffle from one prefecture to another. Even the rail lines to Tokyo are threatened by local partisans starving for rice. Tell me, if they land, what shall we fight with? Bamboo pikes? Boys with slings? Silence. A single clerk scurried forward, a telegram trembling in his hands. Another dispatch from Hiroshima, sir. A surge of civilians fleeing from Osaka has overrun the townships. Food riots are spreading. Officials are hanging themselves to avoid mob justice. Yamamuro slumped back in his seat, eyes hollow. So that is the choice, then? We starve, or we burn. Prince Kanan bowed his head. Perhaps it is better to live without pride than die with it. Kuroda's lips peeled back in a humorless snarl. You would spit on the graves of those already dead? Of Kyoto, of Seoul, of Busan? What did they die for then, if we yield now? What of the Emperor Taisho? What of his memory? Will you condemn him to history as the man who lost the empire? The room fractured, some shouting, some weeping, some simply turning away, unable to meet each other's eyes. The pride of Japan had always been its curse as much as its sword. At last Yamamuro stood, his voice a whisper that somehow carried like a gunshot. Begin discreet contacts through neutral channels. The Swiss or the Swedes. Prepare the ground. If the Germans and Russians will grant terms, we must at least hear them. Kuroda's head fell. The fight was not yet officially over. But in that dim, suffocating room in Tokyo, everyone could taste the bitter residue of defeat. Vladivostok, field headquarters, phone lines humming. Night had fallen over Vladivostok. The harbor lights glittered off dark water heavy with the silhouettes of Russian troop transports being provisioned for the coming assault. Inside a commandeered governor's residence turned staff headquarters, Tsarevich Alexei Romanov paced alone, telegrams and casualty lists strewn across a massive oak desk. A direct, secure line to Bruno's suite within the German carrier crackled to life. A signal operator poked his head through the door. Your Majesty, General Feld-Marshal Bruno von Zehntner, is on the line. Alexei swallowed, his throat raw. Put him through. There was a click, then a hollow hum. Then Bruno's voice, deep and iron-sure, rolled through the receiver. Alexei. A single word, heavy with old authority. Alexei closed his eyes, then found his spine. General Feld-Marshal, I trust you have time for an explanation. A pause on the other end. Then, for what precisely? The missile strikes. Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya. Hundreds of thousands dead or dying, civilians. And no warning, no coordination. You treated Russia not as an ally, but as a subordinate to be informed after the fact. Bruno's exhale was neither contrite nor impatient, simply inevitable. I treated you like a young monarch who has never borne the final burden of decision, who does not yet understand the calculus of thousands versus millions. Alexei bristled. Do not patronize me. Russia has bled for this war. Busan alone. Yes, Bruno cut in, voice abruptly hard. And if we had done it your way, if we had marched step by step from Kyushu to Honshu, fighting street by street, field by field, How many Russian mothers would weep for sons they buried far from their snows? How many widows would wander St. Petersburg streets? Alexei gripped the edge of the desk until his knuckles burned white. So we trade their lives for Japanese children? For peasant families who never even saw a German uniform? Bruno's voice dropped to a somber, unyielding timbre. That is what it means to rule. To choose who dies, because someone will die, no matter what. The only question is whose blood waters the soil. Silence stretched long. Outside, a train whistle moaned over the freight yards. Then Bruno spoke again, quieter. You were but a boy when we first met all those years ago. Do you remember why I first visited your family while you were hiding out in Siberia? Alexei went silent for a long time, and after processing his thoughts, he exhaled deeply. No, I do not. I was too young, and I'm sure you know that. But my father told me why you were in our homes, why you were given such a prestigious position. You fought the Red Menace on our family's behalf, and you won. But what does that have to? Bruno cut the man off and proceeded to tell him the full truth he had not ever been told. I didn't come to your lands as a guest or an attaché. I wasn't even truly invited by the Tsar. I came to Russia with 50,000 men at my back, armed with rifles, machine guns, and artillery. When there was merely a brigade of us who first arrived, I lifted the siege of St. Petersburg after your family had long since fled eastward. I butchered every Red outside its defenses, and tens of thousands of civilians died in the chaos. Bruno paused. Alexei could hear the faint shuffle of papers on the other end, as if the German was pushing ghosts aside. I shot the leader of their so-called army in the head at point blank, while he sniveled and pissed himself in fear. Then I marched my forces east and lit Tsaritsyn ablaze, shelling the city and the rebels who had taken up rifle and sword against your father. His voice hardened. Tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of innocents perished, and I did the same to all of Ingria and the Volga. By the time the blood finished flooding your streets, hundreds of thousands were dead and millions displaced. There was a breath, not regret, but the weighted pause of a man who carried history like a millstone. But in doing so, Alexei, I saved millions from certain death and tens of millions from a far crueler fate. Today, Russians remember me fondly as the Red Scourge, the man who hunted down and eradicated a regime of thieves, murderers, rapists, and psychopaths. His words dropped lower, almost gentle. Your own father understood what I had done was necessary. Despite the collateral damage, I not only saved your family from certain death, I saved Russia from far greater pain than it endured as a result of my actions. There was silence once more. Alexei stood, gripping the receiver, struggling to process Bruno's words. He had always known the broad strokes of that war, heard the sanitized versions in gilded rooms. But the gory details and the scale of suffering his own people had endured and been spared from in equal measure had always been kept from him. Bruno continued. Alexei heard the faint crinkle of maps shifting on the other end. Japan has no more industry, no more means to build another fleet, or enough bullets to arm every boy and old man they'd hand a bamboo spear. What I destroyed in a day would have cost us 2 million Russian and German corpses to achieve on foot. His next words came out softer, yet somehow even heavier. This was mercy, Alexei. Monstrous, yes, but mercy. Alexei leaned back against the wall, the receiver slick in his damp hand. His heart pounded with anger, shame, and relief, all tangled into one poison knot. As much as he longed to be the fair and noble ruler, just like he always imagined his father was, the kind of man he once thought Bruno had been, deep down, he knew the terrible truth. This wasn't a tragedy. This was calculus. Japan would have dragged this war out until tens of millions lay dead, rather than hundreds of thousands. Bruno's cruelty had spared the world far worse cruelty, and that, in its own twisted way, was a form of mercy, especially when men in power were too mad to be reasoned with. At last, Alexei exhaled, breath shaking. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have lashed out at you like that. I should have known. I should have. Bruno stopped him, voice no longer stern, but colored with a subtle, almost paternal gentleness. It is not your fault, Alexei. You were raised to be an emperor of peace. But unfortunately, your father, my friend Nicholas, left us before we could usher in that era together. There was a pause, the sound of distant reports crackling on Bruno's end. There will be another war after this one, and sooner than you may think. You are still an inexperienced leader, but you have time to grow. A sigh, soft and tired. If I were you, I'd start by caring more about how your generals treat the men beneath their command than worrying over the lives of your enemies. Bruno's final words carried a raw edge of pain, the confession of a man haunted by decades of needless waste. I have seen enough young boys used as fodder for steel to last 3 lifetimes. Bruno did not wait for a further response. Nothing more needed to be said. Rather, the abruptness of the conversations served as a greater reminder of the words spoken and the lessons learned. Alexei stood there a long time, the receiver still pressed to his ear, listening to nothing but the quiet drum of his own pulse. At last, he lowered it, stared out the window where supply columns rolled through the streets of Vladivostok. He whispered to himself, voice hollow and resolute, "I will be the Tsar Russia needs me to be." Chapter 561, Men in Distant Castles. The windows of the Oval Office were thrown open, but the summer breeze brought no comfort. It smelled of wet pavement, distant smoke from freight yards, and that rank electric stink that rose from a city stewing under too many bodies, too many fears. President Herbert Hoover sat behind his oak desk, sleeves rolled to his elbows, spectacles perched low on his nose as he reread the latest polling data. It was grim, though not outright damning. A nation still half-starved by the ghosts of the panic, but now shambling toward an awkward recovery. Numbers on the page told one story. Wages marginally up, breadlines shortening, factory doors reopening under new owners. But the people's eyes on the street? They whispered another. A nation torn. Half of them were ready to crown Hoover as the man who had pulled them back from the brink, forgetting entirely that it wasn't his stimulus packages that stabilized markets, but a sudden rush of foreign capital. Capital from places whose names the common American couldn't pronounce, or wouldn't dare to if they understood who truly owned their factories now. The other half, they spat at the name of Herbert Hoover as though it were a swear. For every mill that clattered back to life, there was a mother standing over a child's grave dug shallow in dry Midwestern dirt. For every broker smiling at new shipping orders, there was a miner coughing blood into a rag that cost more than his lunch. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. And the next election was only months away. Across the radio waves, on every clattering newsstand, the voice and grin of Franklin Delano Roosevelt loomed. FDR promised New Deals, broad, empty, populist promises that wrapped around themselves like snakes eating their own tails. He railed against banks even as he courted them behind velvet doors. Spoke of the common man while thumbing through donor ledgers that read like a who's who of New York's remaining industrial barons, nervous that their fortunes might wither if they didn't bet on both horses. Hoover knew the sort. Slick, bright, a patrician smile that had teeth filed to needles. In another timeline, he suspected he'd have liked Roosevelt, maybe even worked with him. But in this one, Roosevelt was worse than a rival. He was a man who had watched the German model unfold, who had seen how swiftly an entire people could be regimented under charismatic ambition and wanted it for himself. Only with unions, patronage, and slush funds instead of discipline and dread. And Hoover? He was too old, too dry, too honest in the wrong ways, too proud to be loved, too moral to be feared. The only comfort Hoover clung to was that the press was quiet, eerily quiet. The same media magnates who only 4 years ago would have torched his every statement, printed cartoon after cartoon of him chasing away breadlines with pitchforks, now simply reported the facts. Dry, clinical, no heat, no favor. Because for once, perhaps the first time since the start of the century, it seemed Bruno von Zehntner's colossal media machine was distracted. Berlin had bigger fish to fry, missiles to build, empires to disembowel. Hoover snorted at the thought. He'd rather have a cold German devil scrutinizing him than an American demagogue with a golden tongue whispering sweet poison to voters. Bruno was predictable. FDR was the sort who'd laugh over your grave and call it reconciliation. The door swung open with practiced caution. Charles Curtis, his vice president, stepped in, hat in hand. His face was drawn tighter than usual. "Sir, the War Department has compiled the latest returns from Manila." Hoover rubbed his temples. The war. God, the damned war. The Philippines was supposed to have been a quick action. a demonstration that American will hadn't atrophied alongside its investments. Instead, it was turning into a slow bleed. Jungles swallowing boys from California to New York, many of which had never fired a rifle outside a county fair. Filipino partisans slipping through lines like smoke. Another 100 bodies sent home this week. Another 100 telegrams. Another 100 mothers receiving visits from men with peaked caps and carefully rehearsed condolences. How bad is it? Hoover asked. Curtis didn't answer directly, just handed over the folder. Hoover skimmed. 784 dead. 2,000 wounded. Half a dozen ambushes gone disastrously wrong. A note about low morale in the coastal encampments. Another about increasing calls among local garrisons for relief rotations. Hoover set it aside, pinching the bridge of his nose. The people will stomach it if it looks like we're winning. And if it doesn't, then they'll vote for the cripple in Hyde Park. Curtis flinched at the cruelty. Hoover didn't apologize. He was beyond soft apologies. It was then that the phone on his desk rang. Not the external line, the secure one that ran through 2 layers of encryption direct from military intelligence. He picked it up. Hoover. Mr. President, came the breathless voice of General MacArthur's liaison in D.C. We've just received a cable from our observers in Okinawa. Sir, the Germans have launched. Well, I don't quite know how to explain it. It is what appears to have been missile strikes on Japan. Hoover's chair creaked as he sat up straighter. Define strikes. Sir, 3 cities have been hit. Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, major industrial centers. Sir, these weren't conventional raids. The payload estimates are, well, they're larger than anything we've ever documented. Not chemical, nor are they conventional explosives. We don't know how they achieved it, but our scientists estimate the yield is the equivalent of between 30 and 50 tons of TNT. A beat of silence. Jesus Christ. Yes, sir. They estimate 40 to 50,000 dead in each city conservatively. More to come from burns, collapses, starvation. There are reports of clouds in the shape of mushrooms visible from the straits. Our embassy in Tokyo is in complete chaos. Hoover's mouth went dry. He had always known Germany was more advanced than the rest of the world. Hell, he had even guessed they were hiding weapons that were truly terrifying somewhere behind the velvet curtains they displayed to the world. But to launch such a daring and devastating attack so brazenly and openly, it was as if the man was daring the world to object. Anything from the League? They're scrambling. Mostly condemnation. But without teeth, sir. The British and the French are still too busy with their own elections. The Italians are silent, though we suspect they have been silently in league with the Germans and Russians for years. Hoover nodded absently. His eyes drifted to the map on his wall. The neat borders. The tiny, careful type labeling oceans and far-off islands. It all looked so fragile, like a child's drawing. When he finally hung up, Curtis was still there, fidgeting by the fireplace. What does it mean? Curtis asked. For us. Hoover's eyes narrowed. It means the world just watched Germany obliterate 3 cities, not with fleets of bombers that could be shot down, but with weapons launched from hundreds of miles away, with perfect accuracy. He pushed himself up, pacing, hands clasped behind his back. It means that the foreign capital flowing into the country from God knows where is, as I always suspected, likely to be coming straight from Innsbruck. And if that's the case, then our industry is beholden to the Reich and the whims of the man at the head of its military. Curtis shifted uncomfortably. Then what do we do? Hoover looked at him flatly. We keep smiling for the cameras. We keep telling the mothers that the boys in Manila are there to preserve freedom. We keep our factories humming with foreign cash, buying back American steel. A cold breath. And we pray Roosevelt doesn't win. Because if he does, and tries to play the populist strongman, tries to challenge Bruno with cheap slogans and half-baked New Deal fantasies, then he'll learn what it means to taunt a man who can erase cities by the hour. Outside, the White House grounds looked as serene as ever. Tourists milled beyond the gates. A gardener trimmed hedges with calm precision. A pair of Secret Service men stood chatting by the drive. Hoover watched them from the window, his face composed. Only the hard set of his jaw betrayed that he was thinking not of voters or campaign stops, but of long-range missiles, of mushroom clouds, of young men dying in the jungles of Luzon for reasons that felt increasingly hollow. A republic. That was what this was supposed to be. a grand experiment in dignity and self-rule. Now it was just another tile on a board owned by men in distant castles, men with names that would never appear on a ballot. Chapter 562, Mamushi's Bite. Stockholm's summer air was a mockery. Cool, crisp, alive with birdsong. As if the world itself hadn't just witnessed the sun descend in 3 poisoned crowns over Japan. In the marble halls of the royal palace, courtiers in Swedish blue and gold moved like silent wraiths, their faces carefully neutral. They kept their eyes lowered, out of respect or fear of what might be read there. For the Emperor of Japan had come to Sweden, not as a peer, but as a man burdened by ash and uncounted graves. Yoshihido's robes were black, the crests of his house embroidered not in gold, but in subdued iron thread. His skin was drawn tight across sharp bones. Since ascending after the sudden collapse of the Taisho line mid-war, he had been the sovereign of a realm already half consumed by the dogs of famine and foreign ambition. Now he was emperor of a nation that had seen its cities unmade in the span of a breath. He stood by a tall window overlooking the palace gardens, hands clasped behind his back, listening to the interpreter murmur quiet updates. Every few moments, his fingers would tighten, the only sign of life in an otherwise marble figure. When he finally spoke, it was in a voice rough with disuse. "Tell me again. They are here? Both of them?" The interpreter bowed deeply. "Hi, Tenno Heike. The Kaiser Wilhelm II arrived last night by rail from Lübeck, and the Grand Prince of Tyrol Bruno von Zehntner arrived early this morning by special air courier from Innsbruck." Yoshihido's gaze did not leave the gardens. A gardener was trimming hedges into the shape of mythic beasts. Somewhere children laughed, chasing bright summer insects across the manicured lawn. It felt obscene. "Mamushi," Yasuhito whispered. His response caught the aide off guard. It was a name not spoken since the days of Meiji, a name that carried respect back then, a friend of Japan and its emperor. Now it was whispered in corners, but never openly. Ever since Bruno fell out with Taisho and his regime, it was an omen to be feared. He turned, and the look in his eyes made the interpreter's knees quake. "Tell the Swedes we will proceed. I will not cower behind courtesy any longer." The great hall had been prepared with almost painful care. Long banners of Japan's rising sun hung side by side with Germany's imperial colors. Swedish guards in bright ceremonial plumes stood at exact intervals, hands resting lightly on gilded sabers. At the far end of the hall stood 2 figures. Wilhelm II still wore the proud mustache and heavy orders of a bygone century. Age had stooped him slightly, but there was fire yet in his eyes, a cruel delight in still being called Kaiser after all the world's attempts to deny him that title. And at his shoulder, like a shadow given breath, stood Bruno von Zehntner. His own imperial regalia was on full display, medals won with blood and iron, not granted to himself by virtue of his birth and the position it gave him. His hands were clasped lightly before him, his expression mild, but his eyes, ice chips set in stone, never ceased their quiet calculation. When Yoshihido entered, Wilhelm's smile flickered broadly. He stepped forward, offering an arm that was not refused. "Your Majesty," the Kaiser intoned in passable Japanese, though thick with a German accent. "We meet at last, though under most regrettable stars." Yoshihido inclined his head. His own voice in German was formal, precise. "I thank His Imperial Majesty for his attendance, and for granting this council in a neutral house." Bruno's lips twitched faintly. "Neutral," he echoed. The first word he had spoken. It was a small, quiet amusement that unsettled every man within earshot. They took their seats at a narrow table of dark oak, the grain rippling like storm-racked seas. No servants remained, only interpreters, who hovered pale and tense. For a time, they exchanged the required courtesies, condolences, ritual condemnations of the tragedy, careful acknowledgments of Japan's suffering. But it was paper covering flame. Yoshihido leaned slightly forward. His hands were folded, his knuckles white. "Let us not pretend," he said. 3 of my cities burn still, though the fires have long since died. 40,000 gone in each. I stand here because my people demand to know by whose hand they were made to perish." Wilhelm opened his mouth, but Bruno lifted a single hand. Even the Kaiser subsided, with only the faintest tightness at the corner of his eye. It was by this hand the order was given, Bruno said softly. There was astonishment on the Japanese hosts' faces. And then Bruno showed the first sign of emotion since the negotiations began. A cruel smirk appeared on his face as he rested his sharp chin on the top of his robust knuckle bones. And why wouldn't I? Your orders were intercepted, quite easily I might add. You were going to arm every man and boy capable of wielding rifle and spear to fight against our invasion. Bruno continued with increased contamination. Your women were taught that our soldiers were beasts, that mothers should smother their own children before we reached them. Victory would have cost us dearly, and drowned your nation in even deeper rivers of blood. It was a price neither of us could afford. Finally, he began to ease up on the aggression and transition into a facade of lament. It is a pity you gave me no option but to destroy your capacity for war in its entirety. And here we are, letting our words end the conflict you all started, rather than bullets and bayonets. I'd say that alone makes my actions justified, wouldn't you? He paused, letting the silence fill with ghosts. Yoshihido's breath shuddered. The interpreter's voice broke, trying to carry it. So it is done, then. You wish to end our challenge in Asia, and you have done so. What remains of my house will sign whatever terms you press upon us, to preserve the hearths that yet stand. Bruno tilted his head. For a terrible instant, there was something almost pitying in his gaze. Majesty, we do not seek the vassalage of Japan. Not now. Not when your islands still bleed so freshly. But we will take from you that which you have stolen from others, and grant it back to those it once belonged to. A brief pause as Bruno drank from the water given to him before continuing. Unlike the Reich, which built its capacity for war based upon its own natural might, you carved an empire out of the lands of your neighbors, because your own lacked the resources to produce a war machine to compete with ours. And you have now lost the right to rule those lands. Yoshihido swallowed once. Twice. How much? Bruno smiled without teeth. You will retain your 4 great home islands, along with Okinawa, Tsushima, the Bonins. We will be gracious and let Sakhalin and the Kurils remain under your banner. But understand, Okinawa will host a Reich naval base. For as long as we deem necessary. Yasuhito remained utterly silent, as if he had truly turned to a marble statue on the spot for the longest of moments. And then a deep sigh. Fine then, such is the cost of defeat. Our empire is gone, and all that remains are the lands owned by my ancestors before the rise of Meiji. I suppose it is a more favorable fate than I was expecting. Where do I sign? A treaty was produced by Wilhelm in its fullest extent. The terms were read carefully by both parties thrice before the signing of it by all involved in the conference. Afterward, as the courtiers re-entered, bustling with tea and solemn platitudes, Wilhelm clapped Bruno on the back, the old man's laughter brittle as frost on glass. Yoshihido stood by the window once more, staring out at gardens that now seemed soaked in blood no one else could see. His chief minister approached hesitantly. Majesty, what shall we tell the Diet? The newspapers? Yoshihido did not answer at first. Then, in a voice so low it was nearly lost to the sighing trees, he said, Tell them we looked into the mouth of the mamushi, and found its poison less cruel than we feared. Chapter 563, The Echoes of Victory. Bruno sighed in relief after the peace had been negotiated. How the deconstruction of the Japanese empire unfolded was not his concern. He was not a politician. He was a soldier, and the war was over. Because of this, Bruno found himself on a flight back to Innsbruck. He had been away for too long. Nearly 3 years in total. From the fall of 1929 to the summer of 1932, the war had waged. Could it have been concluded sooner? Most certainly, but that would have required moving greater assets from the fatherland to the Pacific cause. And that would not have the intended effect Bruno desired. Germany had won the war with Russian support. They had done so entirely with their eastern colonial forces, not a shred of support from the main army or the naval assets designed to counter Britain, France, and America in the Atlantic. That was why the war had lasted so long. Limited manpower, limited resources, small gains that accumulated over years. Ironically, the war between Germany and Japan had lasted nearly a year longer than the Great War itself. When Bruno finally entered his home, he was a tired man. He had only seen his family on brief occasions throughout these last 3 years. His heart was heavy with the costs paid for victory. But the moment he stepped through the door, all of that was forgotten. His wife stood in the doorway, stunned that her man had returned. No message had been sent ahead, no call made. When she saw him there in full regalia, she rushed into his arms as if she were still a young maiden in love, wrapping herself around his neck, kissing him again and again, barely whispering between gasps. "Is it done? Are you home at last? For good this time?" Bruno snickered and kissed her back. She, like him, had aged gracefully. Yet even now there was still no woman in this world he would dare say was more beautiful. As he wiped a graying strand from Heidi's face, he plucked it gently and tossed it away. "That's right. I'm back, and hopefully for good this time." Both of them knew it was a lie. Heidi was as aware as Bruno that the war with Japan was far smaller, far shorter, and far less cruel than the one that loomed on the horizon. But she didn't call him on it. She merely clung tighter to his chest, and in that silence they shared more about the last few years than words ever could. Turin, weeks later. The Kingdom of Italy threw a grand parade to celebrate their victory. Banners of the House of Savoy hung heavy over Turin's main square, their white fields catching in the breeze alongside German imperial eagles. A long procession of soldiers marched beneath them, boots drumming against sun-warmed cobblestones. It was a parade meant more for optics than any real martial pride. Italy had contributed only a token force to the Pacific War, a pair of regiments, some artillery detachments, a handful of naval observers. Not even enough to justify the brass bands or the endless speeches by fat ministers waving feathered hats. But it was enough to claim laurels. People packed every window and crowded every balcony. Women tossed garlands of red camellias that struck steel helmets and rolled off in lazy tumbles. Children waved tricolor flags, shouting themselves hoarse. Through it all, on a reviewing stand draped in Savoy blue, sat King Victor Emmanuel III. His short legs barely reached the step, military tunic straining over a chest that had once been far slimmer. Beside him stood Anna von Zehntner, Bruno's daughter, soon to be crowned princess of Italy by marriage to the kingdom's heir. Her gloved hand rested on Umberto's forearm, her eyes bright with that quiet, regal pleasure that only came from knowing the crowd adored her. The marriage had been arranged over a decade prior when she was still a girl, sealed by contracts thicker than most Bibles. Yet Anna had taken to her new role with startling grace. She entered the Piedmont court preparing for her wedding day with fluent Italian, better spoken than many of the native noblemen, and was often seen visiting hospitals and foundling homes when more jaded royals might have preferred theaters. Anna leaned toward her fiancé, whispering something that made him grin. She looked every inch the royal consort. Perfect posture, chin lifted, a faint flush from the summer heat. But beneath her tailored gown, she wore a dagger at her hip, a gift from Bruno on her 16th name day. Not merely symbolic. The blade had been tempered in his own foundries. That was the von Zehntner legacy, never purely ornamental, even when draped in silk. From the crowd rose cries of "Long live the House of Savoy," and then layered over it, "Long live the German Reich." For a flicker, Anna's eyes darted to a balcony opposite, where one of Bruno's aides watched. She gave the subtlest nod, confirmation that her family's banner still flew securely in this realm, no matter how many Italian colors fluttered around it. Inside a private salon overlooking the square, a row of uniformed attaches stood by the long glass doors, watching the parade. Italian grenadiers, cavalry on horseback, even bersaglieri with plumed hats bobbing at every measured step. On a side table, a polished telegraph machine clicked every few moments as dispatches arrived from Vienna, Berlin, St. Petersburg. An Italian major fussed over it, jotting notes, before finally turning to the figure seated alone near the fireplace. Bruno von Zehntner did not look like a man fresh from a war that reshaped the world. He wore a plain charcoal trench coat, open at the collar. His boots were dusty from the courtyard, his hair streaked deeper with iron than when he'd left Tyrol. Yet his eyes were sharp, absurdly sharp, like dueling rapiers. They settled on the major without warmth. "Well?" he asked, voice low, unhurried. "Reports confirm, Excellency," the major stammered. "Your daughter has been beside the king all afternoon. The people chant her name nearly as often as his. They're calling her Madonna Tedesca. It's..." A spectacle, Bruno cut in. His lips twitched, not quite a smile. Good. That's what this parade is for. Not their few dead in Korea or Manchuria, but to show the alliance endures. That Italy won't fall to socialist delusions or French meddling. The major hesitated. The army is growing. Rapidly. They've nearly doubled mechanized regiments in Lombardy. Your attaches in Milan say the training grounds are full of the latest tank designs, manufactured with lessons from your advisors. And the Navy? Bruno shifted slightly in his chair. 3 new carriers laid down at La Spezia, with your engineers overseeing flight deck integration. More destroyers, modernized torpedo doctrines. Your high seas fleet staff believe by 1940 they might field a Mediterranean strike force nearly equal to France. Bruno's eyes narrowed, not in displeasure, but in thought. That's acceptable, so long as their ambitions stay within the Mediterranean. Italy was an ally of the Reich, though not to the same extent as Russia. Germany provided advisory capacity in engineering and doctrine, little more. The Italians developed their own platforms based on that advice and on German logistical conditions like munitions commonality. Just as Bruno kept many of his most advanced weapons out of Russian hands, such as the new Panzer IIIs, nuclear-powered carriers, atomic warheads already nearing deployment. He let Italy grow carefully. Under his guidance, the Italian army stood in far better shape than in his past life. At least this time, he thought grimly, they might not be a weight dragging to the bottom of the sea when war broke. So he let them have their victory parade. For now, keeping Italy happy and building its national pride was necessary, even if their contributions against Japan had been virtually non-existent. Chapter 564, Dread Without Measure. In the center of the American heartland, the heavy oak table in the War Department strategy room groaned under piles of telegraphs, blurry reconnaissance photographs, and urgent intelligence dossiers. The atmosphere was electric with worry, a silent dread that no one quite dared voice yet. A colonel ran a trembling hand through his hair. Gentlemen, we have the latest aerial assessments. The coastal cities are leveled, not shelled, not burned by ordinary bombardment. It's as if the very air ignited. Entire districts erased in a single concussion. Across the table, a Navy attaché tapped the photographs with a rigid forefinger. Our analysts can't even estimate the tonnage. They said it must be some new form of high-yield explosive. Look here, the shock patterns run for miles, the internal streets gutted by what they described as if a vacuum had torn through. Are you suggesting the Germans have developed some new type of blasting compound? Something beyond our own TNT and Amitol stocks? Another officer asked, his voice cracking. I don't know, the colonel admitted. But whatever it is, it forced the Japanese to surrender outright. After only a handful of strikes. The Secretary of War let out a long breath, the air hissing between his teeth. He reached for a decanter, poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a glass, and didn't bother offering it to anyone else. So let's put this plainly, he growled. Germany just compelled one of the world's largest empires to bend the knee using a handful of what? Enormous aerial munitions? Rockets? A fucking supergun. And this was accomplished by their colonial detachments. Not even the armies they keep on their European frontier. Silence fell like a coffin lid. Finally, the intelligence chief rasped, Sir, if that's what they gave their colonial regiments, then God help us if we ever come to blows with their homeland divisions. No one disagreed. The only sound was the slow swirl of bourbon in the secretary's glass, catching the light like blood. Within the mythic halls of Britain's secret intelligence service where shadows were born in the darkness of men's hearts, the map room at Vauxhall Cross was thick with cigarette smoke and the sharp scent of sweat. Across the walls, global shipping lanes and telegram intercepts sprawled like spiderwebs, pinned over with frantic new annotations. An MI6 controller stabbed a hand toward a cluster of documents laid out on the table. These are our latest reports from our agents embedded in the German colonial ports. Enormous quantities of nitrate compounds. Specialized turbine shipments. And these, he tapped a grainy photograph, what we think are long cylindrical casings. Far larger than anything for standard artillery. Another analyst cleared his throat. And the shock patterns in those Japanese cities, they're like nothing we've ever studied. Not from naval guns, not from conventional aerial bombardment. Entire boroughs flattened outright. Brickwork sucked inward as if by a monstrous breath. Someone nearby whispered, "God above! What sort of ordnance could do that? If it's not sheer weight of explosives, it's some new principle of blast." The controller just shook his head. "We don't know. That's the horror of it. We're still guessing at whether these are new chemical formulations or some advanced pressure device." He leaned over the table, voice dropping. And mind you, these were Germany's colonial garrisons, not their main armies, not the divisions guarding the Rhine or Berlin. If their outposts can field such terror, what does the fatherland hold in reserve? A silence fell so deep the wall clock seemed deafening. Finally, a gray-haired station chief muttered, "Get me Whitehall. We'll need to advise the cabinet that Germany's reach and her mystery weapons might force a complete reconsideration of our continental guarantees." No one disagreed. They were all too busy imagining what London would look like under that same monstrous breath. In the city of Paris, within the reconstructed halls of Versailles, de Gaulle stood rigid at the tall windows of his private office, glaring out at the courtyard where Republican guards drilled under the setting sun. His shoulders heaved with silent fury. On his desk lay the latest report from the Duxian Bureau, pages already crumpled and sweat stained from his grip. It recounted, in grim, clinical terms, how Germany's colonial forces had smashed Japan's armies, toppling a major empire without ever summoning the fatherland's main divisions. Worse still were the closing lines, whispering of strange new bombardments, monstrous concussions that flattened entire coastal districts, tearing structures inward as though the very air itself had collapsed. De Gaulle's throat worked around a raw snarl. "Colonial detachments," he hissed. "Not the line regiments along the Rhine. Not the fortress divisions behind their damned wall of concrete and steel. And yet they brought the rising sun to heal." He spun on the general, waiting nervously by the door. "What news from Belgium and the Netherlands?" The officer swallowed. "Preliminary cables suggest growing disquiet, mon general. Their ministers remember well when our armies poured across their borders under Plan 17. Now with German garrisons dug in from Antwerp clear to Strasbourg, they fear us. They may soon seek explicit guarantees from Berlin." De Gaulle's hands curled into fists, trembling with barely contained rage. So our one-time buffers turned to the very power that occupied us, just to escape another French incursion. He let out a bitter laugh. "Marvelous. France, the terror of her own neighbors." He stepped closer, jabbing a finger at the general's chest. "Then double our armored battalions. Triple the new long-barrel artillery contracts. I want our chemical reserves expanded until every depot groans under the weight. And mark this well. If the Boche ever march, we'll have every railway rigged to burn, every fuel store primed to torch. They may breach our frontiers, but they'll find nothing left to feed their engines." His breath hissed through his teeth. "Because one day, Berlin will grow hungry again, walls or no walls. And when that day comes, we'll drag them through 1,000 miles of ruin before we ever kneel." The general snapped to attention with a brittle salute, then fled the room. Alone, de Gaulle turned back to the courtyard, eyes cold and unblinking. France would stand, or it would burn everything in its path. Chapter 565, A Visceral Truth. It was not long after the war had ended that Bruno received word from the Tyrolean Leibgard that someone unexpected had arrived at his gates. A teenage girl, roughly the same age as his daughter Anna. She was quickly approaching adulthood, though not yet there, and had traveled across the Reich alone. Outside the gates of Bruno's palace, she was stopped by armed guards, and was now raising quite the commotion, demanding entry. The only reason she wasn't outright arrested under suspicion of hostility toward the Tyrolean Grand Prince and his family was because of the name she had uttered, Erich von Humboldt. The moment those words reached him, Bruno shot up from his chair. Still dressed in simple civilian clothes, he looked less like a ruling prince and more like a local sawmill laborer. He rushed through the corridors and out the grand front doors, and when he saw the girl standing there, with raven hair tied into innocent twin braids and dark denim blue eyes he'd seen far too many times before, his jaw fell slack. Erica. Eric had a daughter, conceived in secret with his fiancée shortly before he died. Now that girl was nearly grown. The last time Bruno had seen her, she'd been a little child. He had quietly supported her and her mother for years. But Louise seldom sought Bruno out after that awful day. They met only in passing, visiting Eric's grave on each anniversary. Yet the girl standing here did not look pleased to see her godfather. In fact, her eyes blazed with a fury that was all too familiar to Bruno. Not wanting these buried secrets to explode in public, right outside his gates, he quickly stepped forward and spoke with a soft command. "This is not the place, Erica. Come inside with me, and we'll discuss whatever it is that's compelled you to run away from home and seek me out." Bruno turned and led the way deeper into the estate grounds. The scent of flowers and fruit trees hung thick in the air, captivating the senses. Behind him, Erica stood frozen for a heartbeat, her fists slowly unclenching, her gaze softening as she took in the vibrant surroundings. Then something inside her cracked loose. Before she realized it, her feet moved, slowly, then with gathering urgency, until she was chasing after the man who had been her father's best friend, and his killer. Inside Bruno's study, they sat across from each other in his office. Erica perched stiffly in a fine leather chair, squirming under the weight of the silence, clearly unable to meet Bruno's eyes. Seeing the girl so obviously intimidated, Bruno ducked beneath his desk, retrieved a pair of chilled bottles from the small fridge, and poured them both glasses of Diet Cola. The fizz was startlingly loud in the heavy quiet. He took a long sip before breaking the dam. "Your mother told you, didn't she, that I was the man who put your father in the grave?" Her eyes snapped up, blazing with raw emotion. For a second, Bruno thought she might leap at him, scream, anything to vent the anger that had clearly smoldered in her heart for so long. But then she caught the haunted look in his pale blue eyes, and her own fury collapsed into something cold and jagged. "Grief. How did you know?" Bruno opened a drawer, pulled out a slim file, and set it in front of her. He waited until she cracked it open and began to read before speaking again. "Because there's only one reason I can imagine that would drive you to run away from your mother and come all this way. The fact she didn't call me means she has no idea how far you've traveled, or what you intended." Erica's hands gripped the folder so hard it crumpled, tears dropping onto the pages like tiny spiderweb cracks. Bruno watched carefully, then gently reached out and plucked the file from her hands, unfazed by how tightly she'd clutched it. Only then did her panic ebb. She stared at him, eyes wide, voice hoarse. "Is it true? Everything in there? Did my father do all that?" Bruno gave a small nod. He hadn't included the grim photographs of Eric's work, the silent purges of hidden threats within the Reich. But the names were all there. Whole families, some with foreign ties, others of German nationality but doomed by association. For years, the official story was that Eric had snapped from shell shock and became the worst serial killer the world had ever known. But the truth was so much worse, so much larger. Erica's mother had always told her that version was a lie. But these were official documents, sealed by the Feldgendarmerie. The girl looked ready to shatter. Bruno quietly slid the folder out of sight. "The list is real, but your mother was right about one thing. Your father wasn't a madman twisted by the war. He wasn't a rampaging serial killer." Her eyes sparked with desperate hope, until he delivered the deeper cruelty. "He was an assassin, an agent of the crown, a man too loyal for his own good. Those people he killed, he did it under my orders. He died to protect me, and your mother, who was carrying you at the time. Something he never knew, though it would have only hardened his resolve." Utter silence settled over the room, thick as a burial shroud. Erica sat there trembling, struggling to process the most visceral of truths. A long, oppressive hush fell over the study, so heavy it seemed to flatten the air. Erica sat there trembling, her breath shallow, the weight of everything she'd just learned threatening to break her in two. Bruno leaned back in his chair, elbows resting on the thick arms, watching her quietly, letting her process the ruinous truth at her own pace. Then, just as she drew in a shaky breath to try and speak, a knock sounded at the office door. It was polite, but firm, the knock of a man accustomed to duty, not hesitance. "Grandfather? It's me. May I come in?" The voice was young, but already carrying the steady confidence of a soldier. And Bruno recognized it instantly. His expression softened in a way that made Erica's heart lurch. "Eric, come in." The door swung open, and there stood a young officer in the dress uniform of the German army, the tunic crisp, buttons polished to mirror shine, saber at his hip. But there were no medals pinned to his chest, No campaign ribbons to boast of battles fought. Just the plain marks of a freshly minted lieutenant, proud yet untested. His name, though, was not Eric, a name his father and mother had both chosen in honor of their late godfather, the same man as Erica's father. The moment the name settled in Erica's ears, her head snapped around. She stared at the young officer, her dark blue eyes wide with a startled, searching look. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Bruno watched this unfold with a grim inevitability tightening in his chest. Of course, the name alone was enough to strike a raw nerve, a cruel twist of fate, or perhaps some cosmic reminder of debts never truly paid. Young Eric stepped further into the room, offering Erica a polite nod, unaware of the storm raging behind her eyes. I apologize if I'm interrupting, Grossvader. I was on leave passing through Tyrol and thought I'd surprise you. The guards told me you had company. I didn't realize. He trailed off, noticing the tear tracks on Erica's face, the raw tension that still hung like smoke in the air. Bruno cleared his throat softly, forcing composure back into his voice. Bruno cleared his throat, forcing the ache in his chest into a tighter, colder knot. It's quite all right, Eric. Come, join us for a moment. I'd like you to meet someone very important. Young Eric stepped fully into the study then, closing the door behind him with precise care. He gave Erica a polite nod, but the moment his eyes truly settled on her, something shifted in his face. His posture, already upright, seemed to gather even more respectful strength. Fräulein, he said warmly, bowing slightly at the waist, one hand resting lightly on the hilt of his saber. I beg your pardon for intruding. I had not realized my grandfather was entertaining such charming company. Erica's breath caught. The raw grief and confusion that had been written across her face only moments ago softened into startled surprise, tinged with a sudden flush. Bruno's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, not in displeasure, but in something closer to weary amusement. Of course, he had raised his sons on codes of honor, valor, and reverence for the feminine spirit. It was inevitable his grandsons would carry it even deeper in their blood. And young Eric was clearly entranced, though he masked it well beneath that polished officer's poise. His eyes did not leer or wander, but held Erica's gaze with an earnest warmth that bespoke genuine admiration and the instinctive desire to protect. Please, Eric continued, pulling out a chair and offering it to her with an elegant sweep of his hand, even though she was already seated. If there is anything I can do to make your visit more comfortable, you need only say the word. Erica blinked, caught off guard by such gentle courtliness from a stranger who bore her father's name. Her lips parted, but no sound came forth, leaving only a soft exhale that might have been the ghost of a shy laugh. Meanwhile, Bruno watched them both, the old ache in his chest growing thorny with 100 tangled emotions. Regret for past sins, pride in his family's unbroken knightly virtues, and a dark wonder at what new stories might bloom or bleed from this chance meeting. Chapter 566. To Protect and Serve. Bruno sat in his study long after dusk had settled over Tyrol, the lamps casting warm pools of light across towering shelves. The day's turmoil had finally faded into a tense, uneasy quiet. He had sent Erica home under escort. The girl's composure, fragile as frost on glass, had been gently steadied by young Eric's patient kindness throughout the afternoon. A kindness Bruno had carefully observed from the shadows of doorways and balconies, saying nothing, watching. Now, the old lion of Tyrol sat alone, save for his grandson standing near the fireplace within his office, hands folded behind his back in that precisely measured posture of an officer who had never actually seen war. Eric's expression was neutral, but the faint tension in his shoulders betrayed the thoughts churning beneath the uniform. Bruno broke the silence with a low, tired question. Tell me plainly, Eric, what do you think of her? The young man blinked, perhaps surprised by the abrupt directness. Then he shifted his weight, looking into the flames rather than at his grandfather. She's spirited beneath the grief. Intelligent. Well-bred, certainly. And he paused, almost awkwardly. Then a faint smile ghosted across his lips. Beautiful, if you'll forgive me for saying so. Bruno leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. His pale blue eyes, colder now than any winter Tyrol could muster, studied his grandson for a long, silent moment. I did not ask about her pedigree or her face, boy. I asked what you think of her. In here. He tapped a scarred finger to his chest. Eric hesitated, then let out a slow breath. I think she's endured much, and still has a heart capable of tenderness. That's rare, grandfather, especially among our circles. Bruno nodded once, slowly. Then he steepled his hands before his mouth as though praying to God in heaven. Inside, his mind churned with cold calculations and ancient grief. If Eric was truly taken with Erica, if the children of his closest friend and his own line might, by some quiet miracle, choose each other out of genuine feeling, then he would not stand in their way. It would almost feel just like some fragment of restitution for what he had done to Erica's father, for how Erich von Humboldt had died under Bruno's hand, offering a final salute, calm even as the bullet struck home. That image still visited him in restless hours, sometimes clearer than his own wife's face. At least your line would rise again, old friend. Not in shadow, but openly under my roof. But another part of Bruno, older, colder, forged by decades of maneuver and war, remained keenly aware of dynastic consequence. He had long intended for Eric to marry the crown princess of France, once France bled itself dry again and bent beneath Germany's boot. It was not merely ambition but necessity, a marriage to seal hegemony by blood as surely as by conquest. If Eric tied himself to Erica first, if affection rooted into something permanent, how much would that unravel? Decades of painstaking alliances, thousands of lives already gambled on the long game of German dominion, all cast into uncertainty. Yet as he studied his grandson's honest, open face, Bruno felt a peculiar ache ease into his chest, a weary softness he seldom allowed. He did not wish to become the architect of another private tragedy. Not here. Not with the daughter of the man who had died to protect him and everything he built. I've twisted enough fates for one lifetime, he thought grimly. If these two hearts choose each other, I will not be the one to tear them apart. Bruno finally lowered his hands, his voice gravelly but calm. If your affections for Erica deepen, I will not stop you, nor will I force you. This is your choice to make, Eric, though understand that every choice comes with its own burdens. Eric's head jerked up, startled. Then he dipped it in a slow, respectful nod, something almost like relief flickering through his eyes. Thank you, grandfather. Bruno only gazed back into the fireplace, his expression unreadable. Thank me when the cost is paid, and not before. Because even if he yielded to sentiment here, he knew the world would not. France would still need binding, Tyrol would still need heirs, and the empire he had built from rivers of blood would demand new sacrifices. Whether from Eric, or Erica, or children yet unborn, someone would pay. Someone always did. That was the cruel arithmetic of dynasties. And Bruno, more than anyone alive, understood its ledger could never truly be balanced. Eric left the room not long after. Whatever he had come to see his grandfather for was no longer on his mind. Instead, Bruno returned to his desk and pulled out an old bottle of port, one of the few that remained from the gift King Manuel of Portugal had once given him. He poured himself a glass and swirled it slightly, taking a long sniff before sipping its contents. It's a good thing that Eric has younger brothers. Lest this little curveball the Moirai have thrown me just now would have been far more difficult to deal with. And as Bruno enjoyed himself, he saw a bill on his desk waiting to be signed. For many years, Bruno had thought he had dealt the death blow to the age of knights and chivalry. Today, however, death would be cheated, as would the fates. Bruno put pen to paper, resurrecting the traditions of the past in a way that made them meaningful to the present and future. From this day forward, Tyrol's new nobility, built by merit, would serve as the backbone of the German Reich and be emulated by all other states within the realm. A new nobility to protect the realm and to use their wealth, power, and position to serve the people. For what was the purpose of a knight who did not protect and serve? Chapter 567. Omens of an Uncertain Future. Dark storm clouds gathered over Brussels and its palace, omens of an uncertain future. Within, the king's war room echoed that foreboding, as generals, statesmen, and advisors clustered around a table cluttered with intelligence reports smuggled out of France. As you can see here, new weapons flood the streets of Paris. No doubt from the combined minds of the Allied powers reforged in secrecy after their brutal defeat during the previous war. Silence lingered like a held breath, until the room broke into heated disagreement once more. They are surely working together to develop arms that might compete with the Germans and their new alliance. Have you heard what they are calling them? The axis of evil. A chortle. A sharp snort. Axis of evil? What nonsense. Was it not the Germans who warned us of France's plans to invade in 1914? Was it not their hand joined with ours when the French marched through our borders with rifle and bayonet? King Albert, now aged and wise, inclined his head in somber agreement, as did all present. Each remembered the battles waged, the scars gained, the bonds forged in mud and blood. Belgium's relationship with Germany had remained cordial after that victory. In fact, the Kaiser sent considerable aid to rebuild Brussels after the French had ravaged it. Trade flourished between them, and Belgium was wealthier than ever. But France, bitter, resentful, threatened that prosperity. A sigh escaped Albert's lips, followed by a forlorn gaze through the rain-streaked windows to the storm gathering beyond. I will send the Kaiser a letter. I wish to speak with him, here in Brussels, or there in Berlin. If the French do intend to aggress upon us a second time, I would at least have guarantees this time around. Not a single voice rose in disagreement. North of Belgium's borders, Queen Wilhelmina saw the same grim signs gathering in the west from her palace in Amsterdam. The Netherlands had remained neutral during the last war, narrowly so. They had nearly been dragged in when French forces closed on their borders. Their ties to Germany were so far merely economic, a reliance on trade. But Wilhelmina was no fool. She understood all too well that Germany was the true master of Europe, by land and by sea. The Battle of the North Sea in 1914 had proved that, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the Kaiserlich Marine obliterated the pride of the Royal Navy in a single, decisive clash. Even now, Britain still staggered under the loss, not just of prestige, but of its sense of unchallenged power. The Queen's ministers gathered before her, regal and mature, bowing low despite the reality that her authority was little more than symbolic these days. Prime Minister Charles Regis de Berenbrock, a deeply traditional Catholic, stepped forward. He held the monarchy in profound respect, even if it was largely ceremonial now. Your Royal Highness, reports have reached us of French remilitarization following de Gaulle's coup. Rumor has it Brussels plans to send a delegation to Berlin, or perhaps even King Albert himself will go. If the Night King travels to Berlin in person, I will do the same. But before I make such plans, I wish to know your thoughts. Wilhelmina did not answer at once. She sat very still, processing the shifting tides of Europe. When she finally spoke, her words carried a calm gravity. France has grown bitter in repeated defeat. They lost a generation of men during the Great War, and the madness that gripped them after their second downfall was sealed. Yet, they wish to fight a third time in less than a century. Her voice darkened, her eyes turning glassy, haunted by memories. I fear the Lion of Tyrol will not be so merciful if he is forced to march on Paris twice in his lifetime. No matter how the French or British try to cast the Germans and their allies, we still remember who advanced into Belgium and Luxembourg, unprovoked, I might add. Charles started to reply, but her gaze, sharp as a blade, pinned him in place. If war comes again, we may not be able to remain neutral. It would be wise for you to meet with Albert and Wilhelm in Berlin. We too must consider our place in this world of ours, which is changing rapidly, perhaps beyond our comprehension. There it was, the answer he needed. The world was indeed shifting in ways Amsterdam could no longer predict. But one thing was certain, Germany would not lose this war, even if the entire world rose against them. Japan had proven that. Thus Charles rose, bowed his head deeply, and declared, "Very well. I will do my utmost to secure our place in whatever alliance Albert and Wilhelm may be forging." Wilhelmina's eyes narrowed, her voice slicing the air. "Be sure that you do." With that, the balance of power in Europe began to tilt once more. France would not realize what their actions had unleashed until it was far too late to intervene. They were so consumed by vengeance, they never paused to consider how their fevered rearmament might look to a watching world. To many distant onlookers, France, Britain, and the United States themselves appeared now like relics of a fading age, proud, stubborn, and defiant in a world that had long since moved on without them. If proof of this were needed, it was found in the Philippines, where the United States Army still struggled to put down rebellion. The violence grew with each passing day, and it seemed almost inevitable that for the second time in 3 decades, the Democrats would seize the presidency. If President Herbert Hoover did not find a way to stem the tide of American blood being shed in those distant Pacific territories, then it was only a matter of time before Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the election. And if that were to happen, Bruno would have no choice but to ensure the United States suffered a fate akin to France. Chapter 568, Sanguine and Sable. Dark red drapes were drawn tight against the blistering sun of Madrid, casting the royal chamber into a dim, oppressive gloom. A half-circle of statesmen, generals, and whispering aristocrats gathered before King Alfonso XIII, who sat rigid on his high-backed chair, knuckles whitening as they gripped the gilded arms. On a long table before them lay reports from Catalonia and the Basque provinces, places no longer content to merely grumble about Madrid's taxes and priests. Anarchist pamphlets circulated openly in Barcelona's taverns. Radical speeches stirred Bilbao's crowded squares. Even in the countryside, peasants gathered in sullen knots, clutching ancient rifles and talking of land reform. Spain had always been a fractious kingdom, a patchwork of old grudges bound loosely by crown and church. But now, in the long shadow of Europe's shifting powers, it felt as though the stitches were tearing. A general with a heavy black mustache, one of Alfonso's more reactionary commanders, slammed his fist on the table. "Your Majesty, this cannot stand." Workers in Seville march under red flags. The Catalans whisper of independence. The Basques stockpile arms. Worse yet, there are exiles from France bringing their poisonous syndicalist rot with them. Paris may have its own turmoil, but its plague infects us here. A younger minister, eyes sharp with calculation, countered carefully. Or perhaps, General, it is exactly because France rebuilds that we must tread lightly. De Gaulle's government has already stabilized. He would seize any chance to extend French influence by guaranteeing your throne against these rabble. A treaty of mutual security might spare Madrid the barricades. This sparked immediate outrage among the older nobles. You would invite French regiments to march on Spanish soil again? After what they did under Napoleon? Shall we become their lackey, as Portugal once was? Another voice broke in, the Marqués de Montoro, an aged diplomat whose family had served the crown since Habsburg times. His words were slow, careful, but carried a certain dread. There is another option, sire. Berlin. Or rather, the shadow behind its throne in Tyrol. A shiver of discomfort passed through the chamber. Everyone knew what invoking the name of Bruno von Zehntner meant. It meant inviting the Lion of Tyrol into Spanish affairs, with all the terrifying guarantees and equally fearsome expectations that entailed. Germany is secure, wealthy, and has shown no tolerance for socialist insurrection, the Marqués continued. If your Majesty were to quietly extend feelers to Berlin, we might secure arms, perhaps even advisors, to quell these disturbances before they blossom into open revolt. The general barked a dark laugh. Trade Madrid's independence for security bought in German iron? You forget, Montoro, the Reich plays a longer game than France ever did. Invite them now, and see your grandchildren speaking German in court. But perhaps they would still have a court to speak in at all, Montoro shot back coldly. Throughout it all, King Alfonso XIII remained silent. His dark eyes flickered from speaker to speaker, weighing each argument. He had gambled once before, aligning himself with military strongmen, thinking he could control them. That had nearly lost him his throne. Now he faced a subtler but equally dangerous wager. French patronage might save his crown from the mobs, at the cost of becoming Paris's puppet. German favor promised order, and the dread shadow of being yet another chess piece in Bruno's vast continental designs. At last, Alfonso leaned forward. His voice was hoarse, heavy with sleepless nights. Have our envoys prepare discreet channels to both Paris and Berlin. I will not place Spain's fate in the hands of one foreign power or another until I am certain which can best preserve our sovereignty and my dynasty. His words left the room icy. It was not quite a decision, more a delaying maneuver, as all waited to see which titan of Europe would prove the lesser threat. Outside the palace walls, the bells of Madrid's old cathedrals rang out the hour, echoing through streets where hungry men spoke of revolution and landlords spoke of vengeance. Somewhere in those crowds, the future of Spain was already stirring, and it was doubtful it would wait patiently for kings to decide its course. King Manuel too sat in his office in the palace at Lisbon. For years, he had owed his crown to the moves Bruno played on the chessboard that was the globe. He had been a silent and willing partner in Germany's ambitions. And why wouldn't he be? Gold and silver flooded his vaults thanks to the trade that linked their nations. That wealth bought men, rifles, and artillery to guard his borders. While Spain crumbled under the weight of French refugees during the Great War and the civil chaos that followed, Portugal remained secure. Many of those same refugees now sowed instability within Spain's borders, and that caused Manuel great concern. His wife, Hedwig von Habsburg, older now, mature, long past the childish crush she once had for Bruno, clung to her husband's side as she saw the seal embossed on the letter that caused him such grief. She recognized the sanguine lion rampant regardant crowned in gold, its forelegs standing proudly upon a sable Totenkopf on a field of argent, with a black wolf signal embedded in the corner. It was a coat of arms so uniquely regal and defiant, so modern yet ancient, it struck dread in all who received it. For a long moment, Hedwig was silent, as if her very breath had been stolen. Only after what seemed an eternity did she finally stir. "Well, are you going to open it?" Manuel, who had been quietly nursing the finest port his cellars could offer, debating whether to break the seal from the devil himself, finally cracked the wax and read. A heavy sigh of relief escaped him as he handed the letter to his wife. He wishes to visit with his family. A much-needed vacation after Japan. It's nothing serious. Hedwig, who knew Bruno far better than her husband ever could, scanned the contents again and again for hidden meanings. Finding none, she finally sighed as well. "Then I suppose we must become the most gracious of hosts. Wouldn't you agree?" Manuel only smiled faintly and raised his glass, taking a long, thoughtful drink. The act was answer enough. Chapter 569, House von Zehntner. The harbor at Trieste glittered under a waning afternoon sun. Gulls wheeled above sleek modern ships whose lines spoke more of military power than leisurely cruising, but the vessel tied at the private quay was fitted for luxury all the same. It bore no national markings beyond a discreet Tyrolean pennant snapping in the salt wind. On the docks, stevedores loaded crates of fine wines, silk-lined trunks, and towering hampers of delicacies. The Grand Prince of Tyrole's household, sprawling, illustrious, burdened with titles that spanned half of Europe, was preparing to sail for Lisbon. Bruno himself stood on the wide promenade deck, arms crossed, a small amused smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He watched the organized chaos with the calm of a man who had commanded armies across continents, and found far more unpredictable storms in his own children and grandchildren. Below on the pier, the family assembled in waves. First there was Heidi, regal even in travel dress, murmured crisp instructions to the Tyrolean stewards trying desperately to keep track of every trunk and case. Her sky-blue eyes flashed with matriarchal energy, terrifying even hardened adjutants. Erwin, Bruno's eldest son, but second child, stood near the gangplank with Alia, the once starving Russian orphan now radiant in a gown of Tyrolean emerald. Their brood circled them, 5 children in total. Eric, their firstborn and future heir, tall and golden like his father but with Alia's gentle Slavic eyes, helped keep his younger siblings from stampeding the dockworkers. A short distance away stood Eva, Bruno's eldest daughter and the oldest of the brood, the very image of aristocratic poise, save for the delighted chaos of her 4 children clambering around her skirts. Her husband, Wilhelm, grandson of the old Kaiser, laughed as he patted little Bruno's head, named after his grandfather. The brat had begun to grow like a weed now that he had hit adolescence. Elsa, cool and statuesque, was momentarily distracted by her own twins pulling at her sleeves. At her side stood Alexei, the newly crowned Tsar of Russia, his uniform immaculate even on holiday. Their eldest, Alexander, already carried himself with a small, conscious dignity. Beside him, Young Nicholas tried to look equally imperial and failed spectacularly, chasing after a stray dog. Joseph, Bruno's second son, chatted amiably with his wife Sophie von Hohenberg, the pair surrounded by several blonde-headed children. Sophie's laughter rang bright in the summer air, a sharp contrast to her husband's quieter Prussian reserve. Wilhelm and Heinrich, the next two sons, both strapping officers in sharp, tailored civilian coats, stood side by side, already wagering on who would win the shipboard fencing bouts. Their wives, newlywed and trying to keep the men from rushing off to test their blades right there on the quay, exchanged exasperated smiles. Finally, there were the youngest daughters, Anna and Erika, bright with youthful energy, trailing ribbons and half-formed romantic fantasies. They leaned over the rails giggling, pointing out sleek racing yachts and daring each other to leap the small gap to the dock. Like her sister, Anna, Erika was engaged to a crown prince, the Prince of Greece in particular. Both of them were present for the journey, and speaking formally with their soon-to-be brides. Bruno took it all in with a deep, slow breath. This was why he built empires. Why he brokered marriages, broke republics, crushed conspiracies, annihilated Marxists, and ensured the Reich would last long beyond his own heartbeat. It was not only for the Iron Crown of Germany, though that mattered, too. It was for this living dynasty he had nurtured from fire and blood, for the children who bore his steel in their bones, and the laughter that warmed even his scarred, calculating soul. Beside him, Heidi rested a hand on his arm, following his gaze across the bustling deck. "They've grown so quickly," she whispered. "All of them. It feels like only yesterday Erwin was tugging at your coattail begging to carry your saber." Bruno's mouth twitched into a wry grin. Now he runs half the war industries of the Reich and frets more over steel shipments than duels. A father could hardly ask for a gentler outcome. Heidi's expression softened. Her thumb brushed the back of his hand. Even after decades, her touch steadied him. "And Eric? I've seen how you look at him lately. You're proud." A shadow crossed Bruno's gaze, but it passed. "Yes, he'll carry Tyrol well, and perhaps more than that, should Europe demand it." A call went up from the quarterdeck. "Lines cast off." Children shrieked delightedly, racing to the rails. The ship's whistle gave a deep, resonant blast that rolled across the sunlit harbor. Dockworkers waved caps. Tyrolean guards snapped to attention. Slowly, majestically, the vessel slipped away from Trieste, bound for Lisbon's golden hills. Bruno stood at the prow with his family, feeling Heidi's hand slip into his, Eva on his other side with Wilhelm and little Bruno standing between them. The younger sons gathered nearby, ribbing each other over fencing, hunting, who would best the others in Lisbon's salons. Elsa and Alexei stood close, Alexei pointing out distant sails to Alexander and Nicholas, trying to teach them naval silhouettes. Behind it all, the sun dipped lower, painting the Adriatic in rippling gold. Bruno took it in, the bright chatter, the mingling of Prussian, Russian, Habsburg, and old imperial German blood, all under his banner. This was what he had fought for, what he had stolen decades from the fates to protect. A small smile, rare, genuine, touched his lips. "Let the world do as it will," he thought. "I have built something here no revolution can ever truly touch." And together, the House of von Zehntner sailed toward Portugal, laughter and schemes mingling on the warm salt breeze. Bruno's eyes lingered on each child, each grandchild, memorizing their faces as if daring destiny itself to try and steal them away. The ship cut westward, sails billowing, carrying with it the legacy of a man who had conquered far more than mere kingdoms. Chapter 570, A Pact in Gilded Halls. Gilded eagles gazed down from the walls as Wilhelm II reclined at the conference table, fingers idly toying with the silver chain of his pocket watch. Opposite him sat King Albert of Belgium, elegant but visibly tense, flanked by the stolid Dutch Prime Minister. They'd come to Berlin during the calm before the storm. Both knew that what lay on the horizon was likely another great war. And this time, they wanted to be on the right side from the start. But beneath the silence lay question on everyone's mind. At last, Albert spoke it aloud. "Your Majesty, forgive my candor, but is it not unusual that His Highness the Grand Prince of Tyrol is absent from these proceedings?" A mild smile curved Wilhelm's lips. His gray eyes glinted with faint mischief. "Ah, my dear Albert, Bruno has spent 3 years cloistered in Berlin's war offices, breathing telegram dust, ruling by fountain pen and telegraph wire. Months more overseeing Okinawa's transition. If ever a man earned a season's reprieve from strategy, it is he. The Dutch Prime Minister cleared his throat, eyes darting to the large map of Europe behind Wilhelm's chair. Still, one hears so many stories. That he can recite railway timetables from memory, or that he wept when the new reserves from Tyrol arrived, too young by half. That he ordered the bombardment of Kobe with such precision. Not to mention that ghastly business in Belgrade all those years ago. And now as we sit here to discuss the most important questions of the era, he's suddenly absent. Wilhelm's mustache twitched. He leaned forward, palms splayed on the polished oak. Gentlemen, sometimes even the steeliest men must remember they are flesh. If you wish for him to stand unshaken when next your sons must march, better he has these small indulgences now. Albert offered a faint, somewhat strained smile. I suppose. I only wonder what a man like that does for leisure. Wilhelm barked a short laugh, though there was a tightness behind it. As do I. Aboard the Elsa, named after Bruno's mother and second daughter alike, somewhere west of Sardinia. The sun blazed across calm blue water, gilding every crest. White gulls followed lazily in the yacht's wake. Bruno lay sprawled on a deck lounger, jacket discarded, crisp white shirt open at the throat. A thin volume of verse lay face down on his chest. Even here, relaxation was something he had to rehearse, shoulders occasionally tensing as though expecting a servant to bring fresh dispatches. Heidi approached, barefoot on the warm teak planks, the breeze toying with the pale silk of her gown. She carried a small plate of olives and sliced cheese. With a conspiratorial grin, she dropped into the lounger beside him. Your complexion is improving, you know. Less pallor, more Portuguese rogue. Bruno snorted, eyes still closed. 3 years under gas lamps and mountains of war memoranda, subsisting on black coffee and 2 hours of sleep a night. It does dreadful things to a man's skin. Heidi traced a small circle over the back of his hand, and to his heart. His eyes finally opened, clear, azure as the blue sky above, catching the horizon. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he squeezed her fingers gently. That's why we're here. In years past, Bruno would come home from war as a hollow shell of his former self, taking months, perhaps even years, to readjust to life beyond the trenches. But this was not a war he had fought alongside the young men who followed him into battle. This was a war, the first war he had conducted where he was not permitted to be there in person to support those he ordered into position. It was not the blood and the mud that haunted him now, but the fact he could not endure it alongside those who did. Even so, Heidi noticed that this was a nominal improvement over past years, and thus she sat by her husband's side and hugged his chest, allowing him the peace and comfort he needed with her warmth as an added gift. Wilhelm drummed his fingers again, looking past Albert and the Dutchman as though seeing all the way to the warm western seas. His face set in that complex blend of relief and private concern known only to rulers who had found someone willing to shoulder their darkest burdens. When he returns, he will be the same as before. Perhaps that is tragedy enough. Albert exhaled, unconsciously glancing toward the windows as though expecting to see Tyrolean mountain banners on the parade grounds. Perhaps, or perhaps precisely why Europe sleeps a little safer tonight. A quiet settled over the gilded hall once more, only the ticking of a clock filling the space. Then Wilhelm shifted, steepling his hands atop the table, voice dropping into that low measured cadence he reserved for matters of true state. Now then, gentlemen, to the question of guarantees. He tapped a finger against a slender sheaf of documents that lay neatly stacked before him. France's fever grows worse by the month. De Gaulle's purges have driven out every moderate voice. Their rearmament is ahead of schedule, and the Entente's shadow stretches once more across the Channel. I will not insult you by pretending Belgium or the Netherlands could stand alone should Paris resolve to revisit 1914. But this time I would hope you would take my warnings more seriously than the last. Albert's jaw tightened. He glanced aside at the Dutch Prime Minister, whose mouth had become a thin, colorless line. Your Majesty, Albert said carefully. I made up my mind the moment I saw de Gaulle churning tanks out of his factories by the dozens. Nearly 2 decades ago, we stood alone, outnumbered, holding off a French invasion. Only Germany came to our aid. I've come to honor that allegiance." Wilhelm inclined his head, a subtle expression of surprise in his aging eyes. But he was not alone in that disbelief. The Dutch Prime Minister was absolutely flabbergasted by Albert's remarks. This wasn't just security guarantees. This was a declaration of intent to join the Central Powers, or whatever form it now took. Belgium had been neutral for decades, centuries even. And now? Now they intended to join the Germans in a war against the French, should the banners of de Gaulle take up arms in aggression once more. He couldn't believe his ears. Nor could he properly respond to such an idea. Wilhelm's features softened gently. A look of respect formed in his glassy gaze. Albert and he had not been close friends, even after the war. They were at best on amicable terms, but acquaintance nonetheless. Yet now, in his old age, he could see Bruno's recommendations had borne greater fruit than just victory. "Your words mean more to me than you can imagine, but I will have to advise you should remain neutral. Make no mistake, should France, Britain, or any other nation of the Entente invade your borders, we will be there to defend you, like we were in 1914. We simply ask that this time you take necessary precautions against such a possible eventuality." Albert was not dismayed by the Kaiser's words. In fact, he was relieved. He had come seeking to become an active partner in an alliance that would certainly be fighting in the next war, thinking perhaps this would be his greatest play to ensure Belgium's survival. Yet the Kaiser still intended to guarantee Belgium's independence regardless of their actual commitment to a military alliance. As for the Dutch Prime Minister, he was eager to press for a similar agreement, as he found what the Kaiser had offered Belgium far more favorable than what he had initially thought would be the outcome of these discussions. "You would guarantee the independence of Belgium and the Netherlands in writing?" "In iron and ink both," Wilhelm promised. "Tyrol's industries will extend credit and armaments. Berlin shall coordinate fuel reserves, railway interlinks, even pre-positioned food stocks. Your economies will not bear the strain alone." There was a pause. Then Albert gave a small nod, and the Dutchman leaned forward at last. "Then let us draft these protocols in detail, so that when next Europe's cannons awaken, we do not find ourselves groping in the dark." Wilhelm's expression softened by a fraction, relief hidden behind the slight sag of his shoulders. He reached for the carafe of mineral water, pouring each man a glass. "To the peace we prepare for," he murmured, "and the war we will not shrink from, if forced upon us." They drank, and outside the palace windows, Berlin bustled on oblivious, unaware that in this quiet, gilded room, a second great web was being woven across the continent. Wilhelm lingered a moment after the final toasts, watching the golden sun spill across the long table, catching on cut glass and ink pots. In that hush, he found himself wishing Bruno was here, after all, to weigh these promises with his cold precision, to remind them all that wars were not fought by signatures, but by iron and blood. Then the Kaiser pushed such thoughts aside. This would suffice. For now, Europe had chosen its camps. And that was always how the first drumbeats began. Chapter 571, Promises and Illusions. Mindanao near Holo. The air was hot enough to sear flesh from bone. Even under the patchy jungle canopy, the U.S. column shimmered in the haze. Helmets dull with sweat, Springfield rifles slung loose, eyes darting to every shadow. The captain in charge of the company wiped his brow with a trembling hand. 30 days of patrols. 30 days of endless humid hell, chasing ghosts through valleys that stank of rot and gun oil. Then the jungle erupted. A sharp crack, crack, crack of Mauser rifles split the silence. A corporal 2 steps ahead pitched forward without a sound, his helmet bouncing twice on the packed dirt. Another volley tore through the company's flank, blood misting into leaves. Contact left. Pour it on, the captain screamed, yanking his pistol from its holster. But already his men were scrambling, firing wild into the green void. Somewhere to the right, a Browning automatic rifle chattered desperately. Then came the rush. Dark figures in loose shirts and red bandanas burst from the undergrowth. Crisp knives and old Spanish swords raised high. They fell upon the stunned Americans with gleeful howls. The captain emptied his pistol into one who was close enough he could see a missing front tooth. The man fell backward, but 2 more surged past. A private shrieked as a blade opened his gut from hip to sternum. Another fell to the ground, clutching at a splintered shoulder where a bullet had slammed through. The captain staggered, felt something cold, and wet at his own side. He looked down to see crimson soaking his belt. A Moro warrior with a BOLO already pivoted away, searching for his next kill. Rifle fire dwindled to sporadic pops. Screams echoed off the trees. And then, just as suddenly, the jungle swallowed the attackers again, gone as quickly as they came, leaving only writhing bodies and the coppery stench of blood. The captain fell to his knees, gasping. 28 gone, 14 more wouldn't see another sunrise. He stared at the corpses scattered on the jungle trail, boys from Indiana and Maine, far from any shore they'd known. Above, carrion birds began to circle. A silent echo accompanied the hiss of breath which escaped his lungs. Why are we even here? New York, weeks later. Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat behind the polished oak desk of his suite at the Biltmore Hotel, the soft tick of a carriage clock mingling with the muted roar of Manhattan beyond the glass. His hand drifted absently over a telegram from Manila. The words were sharp and pitiless. Ambush near Holo. 28 dead. 14 wounded. Moro rifles. Loss of 2 field pieces. The Philippines. The islands were a festering ulcer on the campaign trail. Yet paradoxically, they were also his clearest wedge. When the war broke out, Hoover had promised an easy policing action, claimed the Moros would lay down their arms once the broader insurrections ended. Instead, they sharpened their krises and rifles on American columns, melted into jungle, and sent coffins home to Kansas and Ohio. In another time, another place, perhaps FDR would have pitted the president. But the memory of thousands standing hungry outside shuttered banks on Wall Street had hardened his sympathy. This is your fault, Herbert, he thought, smoothing the telegram. You and your party presided over a decade of excess without any lifeboats ready when the tide turned. Now you bungle colonial war as if it were a summer excursion. Albany. A radio sputtered on a mahogany console. A CBS man was reading out casualty lists from the Pacific, each name echoing across rooms where Roosevelt's aides scribbled polls and precinct analyses. Every fresh broadcast about Moro ambushes saw Roosevelt's numbers tick upward. Lewis Howe stood near the window, cigarette smoldering between 2 nicotine-stained fingers. Sir, it is grim to say so, but every boy who comes back draped in stars and stripes rather than marching under them. Well, it is another nail in Hoover's coffin. Roosevelt did not smile. His gaze fell to his leg braces, hidden by the dark cut of his trousers. The irony did not escape him. He could not stand unaided on a parade field, but here he was, poised to send thousands more across oceans. How many funerals before it becomes my coffin instead of his, Lewis? The people want bread first. They want the mills open. But if they see no honor in this war, no spoils worth the blood, they may turn on us just as quickly. You will give them bread, Franklin. You have plans the party never even dreamed of. And as for the war, once it is yours, you can settle it. Cut a protectorate deal. Withdraw the boys home under Victory Arches. Roosevelt said nothing. Outside the window, the Hudson glittered with autumn gold steamers crawling southward. Somewhere in that sprawl of rooftops, men still lined up at relief kitchens. Yet new workshops were hiring again. Railroads were laying fresh ties. Even auto plants in Detroit had reopened lines. None of them knew why. Campaign train, Pennsylvania. A cheer went up as Roosevelt's private car rolled to a halt outside a broad red brick station. Farmers waved hats. Mechanics in oil-stained overalls clutched cardboard signs. Bring them home, FDR. When he took the small stage, carefully braced on his son's arm, his voice carried far stronger than his legs ever could. This nation stands at a crossroads. We can continue to spill the blood of our sons across distant islands with no promise of profit, no banner of triumph, only more graves. Or we can demand accountability, demand strategy worthy of American lives, and put our house in order so no foreign power, no banking cabal, no distant empire ever again decides the fate of our people. The crowd roared. He smiled, sweat slicking the back of his collar despite the cool October air. If only they knew who had already decided so much of their fate, who had quite literally bought the factories that now rehired them, who extended quiet lines of credit that rebuilt their silent towns. But that was a truth for another age. For now, there were ballots to win, soldiers to bring home, at least for long enough that the voters would not notice the next storm on the horizon. Lisbon Harbor. The Elsa steamed gently through the broad Tagus River mouth, her hull gliding past squat fortress batteries and lines of whitewashed houses climbing the hills. Seagulls wheeled overhead, crying against the slate sky. On the upper deck, Bruno von Zehntner stood by the railing, a hand idly resting on polished teak. The salt wind tugged at his open collar and tousled sun bleached strands of his hair. Below, sailors shouted to one another, preparing mooring lines. Somewhere aft, Heidi laughed with Elsa over a tray of sweet pastries, their voices carried faintly by the breeze. But Bruno's attention was elsewhere. Beside him, an ornate shortwave radio set, custom-built for maritime receptions, crackled with the unmistakable cadence of American campaign broadcasts. The English words tumbled through static, half drowned by the gulls and the lapping water. Pennsylvania crowds surging. Bring them home, FDR echoing across the yards. Another damning report from Manila. White House insists occupation continues. Bruno's eyes narrowed just slightly, pupils pale and unblinking. He did not look away from the distant sprawl of Lisbon, its tiled domes, its towers crusted in centuries of sea salt and empire. America stands at the same crossroads it always does, he thought, drunk on her own promise, yet terrified to pay the bill that comes due when world order cracks. Both the Democrats and the Republicans wanted war with Germany. It started with Coolidge and his first attempt to run for office. But Hoover was the first to hold the crown that actually attempted to break free of German control over its institutions. Hoover had been the one who silently waged war against the German Reich, marking up foreign goods with massive tariffs, with no just cause, sending his navy to cut across protected shipping lanes in the East Indies. Hell, he also signed off on clandestine support for the Japanese when the war broke out in the South Pacific. Bruno saw it all. The Oval Office was thoroughly bugged after all. Every communication had from its sacred halls fed right back to Berlin. And through Berlin it found its way to his office in Tyrol. This was one of the reasons his special operations worked behind the scenes, sabotaging supply lines and stockpiles within the Philippines. Hoover was the cold hand that first reached for Germany's throat. Now Roosevelt preened as the new champion of the common man, speaking of breadlines and relief checks, promising to balance the books while simultaneously threatening German assets abroad. A man who would happily wave the same sword as Hoover once the opportunity arose, only with a poet's turn of phrase instead of an accountant's dry ledgers. Bruno's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile, but held none of its warmth. Very well, let Roosevelt have his election. Let the press that still is not under my control crown him savior of the working man. I have no quarrel with illusions. They are often more useful than facts. His gloved fingers drummed once on the gunwale. And when the next storm comes, I will grind him and his Marxist allies into the dirt so thoroughly that even the memory of their slogans will vanish. You will not die of polio in this life, old man. I will see to it that you do not die at all. Not until you have watched your party broken on the wheel. The radio squawked louder for a moment. A reporter in New York was recounting Roosevelt's latest promise to redeem the sacrifice of American boys in the Philippines by redoubling efforts to modernize the fleet. Bruno tilted his head, expression almost curious. Ships, he murmured aloud, his accent a low ghost threading the Portuguese air. Always ships with you people. Always the idea that distance and hull steel will spare you from history's obligations. He turned then, strolling aft toward where Heidi and Elsa sat with glasses of wine. Heidi glanced up, instantly alert to the shadow behind Bruno's eyes. He leaned down, brushed a kiss against her temple, and sank into the deck chair beside them. Lisbon by night is charming, he said lightly, voice smooth as lacquer over iron. We'll dock by dusk. I thought perhaps we might dine at a little place off the Rue Augusta. I'm sure you will enjoy it. Heidi watched him carefully for a heartbeat, then simply nodded, slipping her fingers into his. Elsa chattered on about the gulls, trying to ignore her parents and their shamelessness. And so the family sat beneath a soft, failing sun, Portugal's ochre hills spilling away into deep shadow, while the future of continents weighed silent and heavy in Bruno's chest. Chapter 572, Dynasties and Indiscretions. Lisbon, Palacio Nacional de Ajuda. The heavy oak doors swung open with a hush of red carpet, spilling warm golden lamplight onto the palace steps. Liveried footmen snapped to attention as Bruno, Heidi, and Elsa ascended, flanked by discreet Tyrolean aides in dark dress uniforms. At the top waited King Manuel II, slim and still very much princely in posture despite the streaks of silver at his temples. At his side stood Queen Hedwig, a regal figure in deep emerald satin, Habsburg bearing unmistakable in the lift of her chin. It had been nearly 2 decades since Bruno last saw Hedwig. Then she had been little more than a girl, barely an adult. Or perhaps not even. Time flew by so swiftly, Bruno could hardly remember such details these days. But what he did remember was that she had been flush with the court's petty intrigues, eyes that had lingered too long and filled with spite at the Prussian general who attended Franz Joseph's funeral in full Austro-Hungarian ceremonial garb. Now those same eyes widened just a fraction at the sight of him. The old memory flashed across her features, quickly masked by the polite composure of queens. Bruno bowed with the easy grace of practiced courts. Heidi, every inch the grand princess, swept into her curtsy with a faintly mischievous smile. She had seen that tiny spark in Hedwig's gaze. Eva, Elsa, and all the rest of his daughters and granddaughters, delicate and sharp-eyed, performed their own polite greeting with a confidence that pleased Bruno. "Your Majesties," Bruno said, voice smooth, the faintest edge of steel softened by familiarity. "Portugal remains the jewel of the Atlantic, though I suspect it is your hospitality that draws men here, not merely your shores." Manuel laughed, cracking the ice. Though beneath it swam darker currents, he stepped forward, clasped Bruno's hand in both of his. "And Tyrol still sends us the finest hunters, the keenest minds, and, from what I hear whispered in our vineyards, the most troublesome statesmen." He cast a conspiratorial glance at Hedwig, who colored almost imperceptibly. Heidi raised an eyebrow at Bruno, her lips twitching. "A pleasure to finally host you here, Highness," Hedwig said, dipping her chin. Her voice did not betray the slight catch in her breath. "Your family is most welcome in Lisbon." That evening, in the grand dining hall. The hall was alive with the glow of countless crystal sconces, laughter and music curling through columns of pale marble. Portuguese nobles mingled with Tyrolean retainers and cautious German envoys, all swept along by the easy charm of Lisbon's court. Bruno found himself seated opposite King Manuel at a long mahogany table dressed in silver and dark green. Further down, Heidi and Hedwig spoke in low, private tones that might have been about children, or perhaps about distant days when a young archduchess carried a foolish torch for a foreign general. There was no real danger in it. Only the faint embarrassment of old girlish affections rearing up at inconvenient hours. Manuel poured Bruno a delicate glass of port, his expression sobering. "You heard about Seville?" he said quietly. "Of course," Bruno replied. "If Spain tears itself apart any further, it risks drawing in every power from Marseilles to Tangier. Your ports will bear the weight of that chaos long before Vienna ever hears the echoes." Manuel ran a hand through his neatly groomed beard. "That is my fear. The Republic is fragile, beset by monarchists who squabble among themselves as much as with Madrid. I wonder sometimes if we," he gestured to himself and Hedwig, "are not the last thin ribbon holding this country from provincial ruin." Bruno's pale eyes flickered toward Heidi, who laughed now with Hedwig, oblivious for a blessed moment to the fractures beneath Iberian civility. "Then perhaps, my friend," Bruno said at last, "it falls to us to see that the old bloodlines do not simply vanish. Tyrol stands ready to guarantee Portuguese independence if Spain's troubles spill across your borders. And, should the day come when harder measures are required, you will not stand alone." Manuel's relief was carefully hidden behind a sip of port, but Bruno caught the slight sag of his shoulders. "After all you have done for me and my wife, after all that I have heard about your reputation over the years, I was half expecting you to whisper some poisonous conspiracy at my table. And yet you speak of guarantees, and guarantees alone." Bruno allowed the faintest smile. "Well, I wasn't going to mention it on my first night, but if you wish to broach such a perilous topic, far be it from me to play coy. Those words, murmured beneath the pianist's soaring chords and the laughter of two royal houses, would shape the Iberian world for decades to come. Later, on the balcony, the warm Atlantic breeze carried hints of salt and orange blossom. Below, the lights of Lisbon shimmered across the Tagus. Hedwig joined Bruno for a brief moment as Heidi walked ahead with their daughters, showing her a collection of marble busts along the parapet. "I did once imagine," Hedwig said softly, eyes on the river, "that I might have ended up in your palace instead of these shores." Bruno inclined his head. "And now you are Queen of Portugal, mother to a bright line of heirs, and mistress of a city even Rome envied." She laughed, a small, wistful sound. "Do not flatter me out of your own discomfort, Bruno. I have no regrets. It pains me to admit, but seeing you here, I remember being 15, and it embarrasses me all over again. The way I thought I had chosen Manuel over you, and the lies I told myself at that troubled age to cope with the fact, it makes me want to jump off this ledge and cast myself into the sea." He gave her a formal little bow, voice perfectly smooth. "Then let us be grateful for the foolish hearts of children. Without them, this world would be dull indeed." As they rejoined their families, the small tension faded, replaced by an easier mirth. Manuel clasped Bruno by the shoulder once more, speaking in low, earnest tones about treaties and dispatch riders from Galicia. Heidi smiled at Hedwig. Elsa and Eva both giggled at some joke only they understood, and the Lisbon night rolled on, hiding within it the delicate threads of alliances that might shape the next century. Chapter 573, The Crown on a Knife's Edge. A storm hung heavy over Madrid, rain streaking the ornate windows of the royal council chamber and drumming on the slate roofs of the capital beyond. Inside, beneath the high coffered ceiling, Spain's king stood braced at the edge of a vast table cluttered with dispatches, intelligence folders, and a sprawling map of Iberia pinned with colored flags. Alfonso XII's hand rested on the table's edge, knuckles pale. His eyes dark, sharp, increasingly haunted these days, swept over the map again and again, as if by sheer force of will he could rearrange the loyalties of provinces and regiments. To his right hovered General Barrera, a thick mustache twitching whenever a fresh report arrived. To his left, the Minister of the Interior shuffled through communiques that smelled of damp ink and sweat. Across the map, the Chief of Intelligence cleared his throat, tapping a trembling finger on a cluster of pins south of Zaragoza. "Your Majesty, the anarchist cells in Aragon have doubled in number since the collapse of the textile consortium last quarter. They've begun coordinating strikes with CNT syndicalists in Catalonia. And now," he slid a thin slip of paper across the table, "they're openly calling for arms, for land seizures, for the execution of local nobility." Alfonso read the printed handbill, its lurid promises of bread and liberty, and dropped it with a faint curl of disgust. His gaze shifted to the bright red pins scattered through Barcelona, Valencia, Sevilla. And what of these Francais exiles still clogging our southern ports? Has not a year of harbor charity softened their revolutionary spirit? The Minister of the Interior shifted uncomfortably. "Your Majesty, with respect, many of these men are not harmless laborers but petty officers and rabble-rousers driven from Marseille and Toulouse when de Gaulle's purges began. They refuse to take Spanish oaths. They congregate in foreign clubs, trading seditious pamphlets. We even found caches of pistols marked with old French Republican seals." General Barrera slammed a thick palm on the table, rattling crystal decanters. "Then expel them. Drive them to Portugal or the sea. Spain is not their refuge if they spit on your crown." "Easy for you to say," muttered the minister. "The factories in Cadiz and Cartagena need cheap hands. Without those Frenchmen, we might not finish another dry dock before year's end." The king cut across them with a voice low but cold as Toledo steel. "We are not England to fatten on mercantile illusions. We are Spain, born of forged crowns and gunpowder. If these men threaten our peace, they will be dealt with, no matter who pays whose wages." A fresh aide burst through the chamber doors, boots squeaking. He offered a rigid salute and handed over a wire dispatch. The Chief of Intelligence scanned it, his breath catching. "From the Guardia Civil in Salamanca, sire. Another train seized by peasant committees. They strung up the station master, accused him of hoarding grain. Local police stood down rather than fire on the crowd. General Barrera's face went purple. Dios mío. Even our own police hesitate to uphold order. Not police, corrected the king quietly. Our people. And that is the greater danger. He stepped back from the map then, as though it physically repulsed him. Rain lashed harder against the window, tiny rivulets racing one another down the glass. How long before this becomes more than isolated brush fires? How long before Barcelona openly hoists a red banner? Before Valencia declares for a workers' junta? And what then of our army? Will they obey me? Or will half march under socialist slogans as they did in Russia in 1905 and France in 1916? Silence. Barrera studied his boots. The minister thumbed rosary beads half hidden in his coat pocket. Only the chief of intelligence dared whisper the thought aloud. It may come to preemptive arrests, Your Majesty. Perhaps even martial law. Break the unions before they fully merge with these foreign radicals. Put down the worst provinces with force now, rather than let them grow a common cause. Alfonso let out a long, hollow breath. You would have me shatter Spain to save her. Spill Castilian blood upon Castilian stones to keep this crown balanced on my brow. Barrera stiffened. Better our own blood, Your Majesty, than to see French agents or godless anarchists dictate your decrees in this very palace. A fresh rumble of thunder rolled overhead. Somewhere deep in Madrid, a church bell struck 6. Alfonso closed his eyes, fingers tightening on the table's edge. At last he nodded once, curt and final. Draft the warrants. Issue discreet orders to the Guardia and the Carabineros. But mark this well, gentlemen, there will be no mass roundups, no orgies of revenge. Spain will not become Portugal in miniature. Our people must see discipline, not a vulture's feast. Barrera inclined his head. As you command, sire. The council began to disperse, papers gathered under arms. Hushed orders passed down narrow palace corridors already echoing with the footsteps of history. Alfonso lingered a moment longer, alone now with the rain. His gaze drifted again to the map, to the red pins in Barcelona, the new black ones sprouting across the Basque Hills. Hold a little longer, mi España, he murmured, voice barely above prayer. Hold a little longer for me. And beyond the walls of the royal palace, Madrid waited with bated breath, straining under the weight of rival banners, while Europe, and perhaps the world, prepared to see which way Spain would finally break. Soldiers clad in camouflage uniforms and wielding rifles more bakelite than steel stood outside Budapest, instructing the local Hungarian Royal Army in counter-insurgency operations. In the decade and a half since his war for Greater Hungary began, the king whose officers crowned him in the absence of Habsburg authority had achieved his goals with near completion. Save for that stubborn wedge of Transylvania, half free state, half Romanian protectorate, Hungary had reclaimed its historic bounds. But in doing so, they had inherited much of the instability that had plagued the dual monarchy before their independence. Of course, weapons could be bought, and expertise sourced from abroad. The werewolf group, Bruno's private shadow army, still stalked the post-colonial world. However, aside from some minor operations of the clandestine variety, they had stayed out of the German-Japanese war almost entirely. Instead, a large part of their forces were centered in the Balkans, given shelter by the Crown of Hungary in exchange for sharing their expertise for silver, gold, and haven. The Hungarian realm now encompassed much of the lands east and south of the German Reich, and because of this, they now had a dozen ethnicity and half a dozen religions fighting over petty village rivalries, some of which went back centuries. As a result, law and order were enforced by the barrel of a gun and the king's decree, written on parchment with the ink of a fountain pen. And Ernst Röhm could not help but sigh, the silver wolf sangles on his collar glistening under the sunlight as a plume of smoke escaped his lungs. My wolves grow fat. The stability of peace had made the paramilitary commander anxious and eager, and with the situation in Iberia entering a state of crisis, he may soon have his wish. Chapter 574, Oaths over Silver and Blood. The first shots cracked out near the old textile yards off Cara de Pau Claris. By dusk, they had spread like wildfire through the veins of the city. Young men in loose linen shirts, red and black kerchiefs knotted at their throats, sprinted across the wide boulevards. In their hands were French rifles, chassepôts and labels smuggled down from Perpignan with the help of de Gaulle's new Republican militias. They chanted in Catalan, rough words that mixed local pride with anarchist fury. Banners daubed with snarling suns and clenched fists fluttered from balconies. Already, shopkeepers were hammering boards over their windows. And above it all, painted hastily on the plaster walls of a closed café, Visca Catalunya Liure. Long live Free Catalonia. Near the Passeig de Gràcia, a trio of gunmen hunkered behind an overturned tramcar, one of them a boy who could not have been more than 17. He laughed breathlessly as he fired a shot down the street, his recoil-drunk shoulder nearly betraying his aim. Another leaned out just long enough to hurl a bottle of petrol that shattered against the iron gate of the Banco Hispano-Colonial. Flames snaked up the facade, oily black smoke curling into the evening sky. Across the plaza, local Guardia Civil in dark green tunics tried to form a cordon. But the jeering crowd outnumbered them 5-1, and every minute more laborers and discontented students surged from side streets. A captain pulled at his thick mustache, barked something to his sergeant. The line faltered, then broke. Helmets clattered to the cobbles. A few men ripped off their insignia, flinging them aside before vanishing into alleys. The rest simply ran, rifles bouncing on leather slings. The crowd roared. Within moments, the old police station's windows were smashed, papers and shattered furniture thrown out in great belches of chaos. The next morning, a telegraph key chattered inside the royal palace in Madrid. A clerk dashed breathlessly into the war council chamber, eyes wide. "Your Majesty," he panted, "Barcelona is lost." The local garrison refused to deploy without direct orders. The police have melted into the crowd. The anarchists have seized the municipal armory. They're flying Catalan flags side by side with red syndicalist banners over the plaza. King Alfonso Xi's jaw tightened. He looked down at a map of Spain spread beneath his gloved hands, then at his generals gathered around him. "Send the 4th Mechanized from Zaragoza. Tanks, cavalry, infantry, everything. Tell General Barrera I expect the city under control within 48 hours. He paused. His eyes were bloodshot from sleepless nights. "And have the heralds draft a proclamation. Make it clear, Barcelona remains under the crown. This is not merely a question of Madrid's pride. It is Spain's very survival." 2 days later, in the outskirts of Barcelona, steel snouts pushed down the tree-lined highway. Old tanks from the Great War, refurbished with heavier machine guns and cannons, rumbled forward on clattering treads. Troopers in tan field tunics marched alongside them, sweat streaking their necks despite the crisp air. They were led by cavalry scouts on short Andalusian horses, lances tucked high. From behind their lines, the slow toll of cathedral bells echoed like a funeral song. A captain rode up to the lead tank, shouted an order. The convoy began to fan out, infantry moving house to house, rifles tight to shoulders. In the city's outskirts, shots snapped from shuttered windows. A tank turned its stubby gun, fired once. The shell punched through a stone wall, sending a plume of dust and masonry into the street. Screams followed. Barricades rose by the hundreds. Makeshift ramparts of furniture, paving stones, even old iron bed frames. Behind them, men and women crouched with pistols and knives, their faces set in a defiant rictus. At one such barricade on Cara de Mallorca, an old anarchist with a black sash tied around his brow stood atop a heap of crates. He waved a battered Mauser in the air, voice ragged as he shouted to the crowd. "They send tanks against the people. The king fears us so much he cloaks his terror in steel. Will you bow? Will you let Madrid chain us again?" A ragged chorus of no rolled back at him. The old man fired a single round toward the oncoming soldiers. Then another, then a third. The last cracked wide, harmless against stone, but it was enough. The line of Spanish infantry surged. Rifle bolts slammed home. A machine gun crew dropped prone, barrel stitching flame. The old man toppled backward in silence. By nightfall, the tanks had pushed into the Eisample, their caterpillar tracks grinding across Catalan slogans painted on the streets. The flames of sacked buildings reflected in their riveted hulls. From high balconies, families wept or hurled pots and bricks. In darkened alleys, more serious men readied grenades bought with French coins. A captain of the Royal Army, mud splattered up to his thighs, paused at a street corner. He looked back toward the long, churning column of troops that stretched for blocks. "They'll hate us for this," he muttered to his adjutant. "Even if we win. Especially if we win." His adjutant only stared ahead, lips moving over a silent prayer. Far away in Paris, the evening papers ran headlines in thick block letters. "Blood in Barcelona. Alfonso crushes uprising with tanks. De Gaulle. Frenchmen must defend liberty everywhere." And in Madrid, under the opulent chandeliers of his private office, Alfonso XIII poured himself a measure of dark brandy. The glass shook just slightly in his grasp. Outside, the lamps of the capital burned on, casting long shadows, each one hinting at future reckonings yet to come. Bruno read the Madrid papers in silence, seated at King Manuel's ornate breakfast table. What had been a lively morning among two royal households now hung thick with unease. Those who knew Bruno understood all too well. If he was quiet in the face of such headlines, it meant something was already turning, vast and unseen. And it would unfold, as always, in the most subtle and unfathomable of ways. At last, he laid the paper aside, seeming almost bored by its grim columns. He picked up his silver fork and calmly resumed his meal. Manuel could bear it no longer. His own pulse thundered in his throat. He exhaled, forcing a brittle calm. "Well?" Bruno's pale eyes slid lazily toward him, one brow arching in faint amusement. "Well, what? Be precise, Manuel. How could I possibly guess what weighs on your mind with so vague a question?" His smile was playful, but only on the surface. Hedwig's hands tightened on the tablecloth, knuckles paling. She had seen that expression before. It heralded grim tides. Manuel drew a long, sharp breath. He set his cutlery down with theatrical care, trying to gather dignity before it fled him entirely. "Spain is my neighbor. If they descend into civil war, my own throne stands in the path of ruin. So, Bruno, what is your plan? What shadow will you cast over Iberia this time?" Bruno paused, knife and fork hovering, then set them down with deliberate, chilling precision. He straightened slightly, posture shifting into something regal, immense, as if the entire weight of the Alps had suddenly settled behind his shoulders. "I plan to do nothing," he said softly. Then his voice lowered, an edge of iron sliding beneath the velvet. "But de Gaulle should be wary. Instigating violence in the Pyrenees invites the wolves currently nesting in the Carpathians, who by now have grown hungry and restless." A hush dropped over the table. Even the servants at the walls seemed to still. Manuel exhaled slowly, dread flickering behind his eyes. Bruno picked up his utensils again, carving delicately into his breakfast as though the conversation had never occurred. There was no need to speak it aloud. The werewolf group would be unleashed, and that single truth carried its own fearsome miasma through the palace dining hall. Chapter 575, Return to Order. Navarre, near Tudela, dusk. A dusty wind tore across the old Roman road, rattling shutters in whitewashed hamlets and carrying the faint reek of burnt hay. Two covered trucks crawled along the ruts, their black-painted flanks bearing no insignia. Only mud-caked license plates and a sullen cluster of local Guardia escorts gave any clue they were official at all. Inside the lead truck, under a canvas rig, wooden crates stenciled with blocky Gothic script were wedged tight in straw. Rifles, submachine guns, sealed tins of 8mm Mauser rounds, all still slick with factory grease from somewhere east of Vienna. A broad-shouldered German in a drab field tunic watched the countryside slip by. Ernst Rohm's wolves had arrived. He ran a finger over the silver Wolfsangel badge on his collar, then adjusted the riding crop across his knees. Beside him, a wiry Spaniard in the faded green of a Guardia lieutenant lit a cigarette with trembling hands. "Senor Hauptmann," he rasped, exhaling a ghost of smoke. "The governor in Zaragoza, he does not know you are coming. If the Cortes learns foreign companies march through Aragon, then remind him." The werewolf officer cut in quietly, his accent grinding each Spanish syllable, that it is either foreign rifles or Barcelona's syndicalists with their French coin and French slogans. If he prefers red banners in the Plaza del Pilar, we can turn around. The Spaniard swallowed, nodding, smoke curling between sweat-streaked temples. Hours later, an abandoned guardia post near Galler. Bare bulbs flickered in the old barracks hall. Shadows sprawled long over cracked tile floors. Local officers, some stripped of rank insignia, some clutching battered Mausers like talismans, sat along trestle tables littered with manifests and scribbled rosters. A werewolf NCO read names from a clipboard. For each, a curt nod or a subtle mark. Sometimes a throat cleared. A guard shifted nervously. A handful of men were led quietly from the room to verify credentials, the Germans said. No one expected to see them again. At the far end of the hall, Rome leaned over a new map of Catalonia. Tiny red pins clustered along the Ebro like rot. He tapped one hard enough to leave an indent in the paper. Here, tomorrow, your guard and our men will make an example. Shoot the agitators. Hang their papers in the square, so all Navarre knows what awaits traitors. The Spanish captain opposite him, a gaunt man with sunken eyes, managed a hoarse agreement. And after that, the captain whispered, Madrid is hesitant. The Cortes, they fear more unrest. Rome's pale eyes glinted under the lamp. Tell them Berlin does not, nor does Tyrol. If necessary, we will cleanse all the way to Valencia, or until no man dares whisper syndical slogans again. Outside, by the truck bay, young werewolf volunteers unloaded the last crates under a crescent moon. Heavy boots crushed straw as carbines were racked, ammunition checked, spare magazines stacked in neat pyramids. One paused, wiping sweat from his brow. In the distance, church bells tolled for evening mass, strangely soft against the low mechanical clatter of bolt checks and magazine slides. Another laughed under his breath, shouldering a STG 25 mod. 32. Catholics pray while we sharpen the knives. God's work, yeah. The first just spat into the dust. No saints in this business. Only survivors. By dawn, werewolf detachments moved like gray wraiths along the Ebro, pairing local gendarmerie with long columns of blacklists. Lists typed up in Lisbon and Berlin weeks ago. And across Catalonia, farmhouses and workshops awoke to hammering on doors, boots on stairs, and the hush of men who did not wear Spanish colors on their shoulders, but who spoke with authority all the same. A new order had begun to settle over the fractious north, born not from ballots or sermons, but from cartridge clips and quiet, early morning verdicts. Madrid, Royal Palace. The antechamber outside Alfonso Xi's private study buzzed with nervous murmurs, aides whispering to courtiers, officials clutching telegrams so tightly the papers crinkled under white knuckles. Inside, the king sat alone by a high window, one hand gripping the arm of his chair, the other drumming a ceaseless tattoo on the polished mahogany. Beyond the glass, the royal gardens drooped under heavy dew, oblivious to the currents shifting beneath Spain's fragile peace. Then the door opened, and the Minister of the Interior entered. His face was gray, eyes wide and restless as though he hadn't slept in days. Alfonso straightened, his posture snapping from a wearied slump to razor-edged alertness. Well, speak. The minister swallowed. Your Majesty, we have received disturbing accounts out of Barcelona and Tarragona, even small villages in Girona. More anarchist demonstrations? The king asked sharply. Strikes? Train seizures again? No, sire. The minister approached, voice dropping to a hoarse near whisper. It's not strikes. It's slaughter. He laid a slim leather folder on the small table by the king's elbow. Alfonso opened it with slow hands. Inside were telegraphs from civil governors, letters intercepted from local mayors, scribbled reports by Guardia officers. He read one line aloud, voice hollow. Bodies strung from lampposts along the Avinguda diagonal, each with a placard nailed to their chests reading, Traitor to Crown and Country. Another report, barely legible through smeared pencil, described dozens found in shallow ditches outside Sabadell. Men with the red bandanas of the Sinti still knotted around their necks, throats cut with professional precision. Alfonso's jaw tightened. And these are not Guardia actions. You assured me we had not yet invoked martial tribunals. We have not, Your Majesty, the minister rasped. The local police stations report seeing masked men in the streets at night. Strangers speaking a harsh, foreign tongue, armed with automatic carbines they describe as too fine for any peasant. And armored lorries painted over to hide their origins. The king pressed a hand over his mouth. Memory stabbed at him. The Germans had reserved advanced weapons that had never been confirmed. But whispers of magazine-fed automatic carbines being secretly issued to the mercenary group, which bore the Wolfsangel as its banner, had long since spread abroad. If such weapons were spotted here, Berlin's shadow army had entered Spain's borders. Or should he say Tyrol's? The king closed the folder with sudden violence, the pages inside snapping together like a guillotine. And the people? He asked, forcing calm into his voice. How does Barcelona itself react? Is there any rallying to these dead men's causes? The minister's breath caught. Quite the opposite, sire. The markets reopened by midday. Strikers melted away. C&T offices stand empty, looted by their own neighbors, who carried off printing presses and typewriters as if fearful they might mark them next. Alfonso leaned back, hand gripping the armrest until it creaked. Outside, church bells tolled the Angelus, their solemn peal carrying across Madrid like a funeral march. So, he whispered, almost to himself, they achieved by terror in a fortnight what my regiments could not with a year of orderly decrees. The minister hesitated, then blurted, Your Majesty, we cannot allow foreign butchers to write Spain's fate. If this is von Zehntner's hand, he acts without your crown's sanction, without even your knowledge. A faint ghost of a smile curled Alfonso's lips. Do you truly believe that matters? To the farmers in Valencia, to the stevedores in Cadiz, to the old men who still paint Bourbon lilies on their shutters? Order has returned, minister. It is a grim, dark order, born of fear and midnight gunshots. But it is order. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, then looked up again, voice regaining its iron. Still, I will not have Spain ruled by whispers of wolves in the night. Issue instructions to all governors. No foreign militias may quarter in our provinces without my explicit decree. Should any man bearing arms fail to present papers of the Spanish crown, they are to be disarmed or driven out. The minister bowed low, relief flickering behind his eyes. As you command, sire. As the doors closed behind him, Alfonso rose and crossed to the window. Far off he could see the spire of the royal basilica, stark against storm-thickening clouds. Let them whisper of wolves in Catalonia, he thought. So long as Madrid stands and the orchards ripen in the south, perhaps that is enough of a throne for any king. But even in that private moment of rationalization, he could not help shivering at the thought of men with no flags, no insignia, speaking guttural commands in the dark and leaving trails of corpses behind them, all in the name of stability. Outside, Madrid breathed on, blissfully ignorant, while beneath its cobblestones, the next fractures were already forming.